Magic and Mystery by Allegory for Hatred. I want to say before continuing this audio reading that I do not own this story. Please check the description to find the story summary and support Allegory for Hatred, the original author, on AO3. I changed how I have set the chapters. I hope it'll be easier to keep track of what chapter you're on. Thank you. Enjoy. One unusual things. You'll get used to it. Dazai glanced up from his hands, frowning. It was strange. The half of his face usually hidden behind bandages was open to the cool air. He didn't let the unusual sensation show on his face. You're the one always telling me not to pick at those bandages. Maybe it'll get infected, and I'll die. Mori offered a pleasant smile. It's all healed up, I'm afraid, I guess. Chuckling like he knew something Dazai didn't, the doctor waved off the concern. Dazai would think the man irritating if he weren't currently in Mori's care. A small mercy. Did you do the research I asked you to? Hogwarts, right? He sighed and kicked a foot out, narrowly missing hitting his doctor in the shin. They're clever to avoid detection, but they aren't really doing much with all that power. Seems like there's a lot of infighting. Is that why you're suddenly so curious about this place, sir? Something like that. You aren't trying to get out of our deal, are you? Dazai pouted. I see the logic in not telling the me purpose of this mission, but also it's annoying. How am I meant to get information if all I know is you want me to attend this Hogwarts place? I'll just kill myself for sure. Ah, I read it somewhere. Let me look. He suddenly reached into his pocket, clicking noisily on a phone. Something about a killing curse. Hold on. Mori raised a brow, that insufferable smile unshakable. Well, let's not get carried away, Dazai. Besides, wouldn't you like to make friends at your new school? I'm sure they wouldn't appreciate all this suicide nonsense. Once Dazai's phone had returned to his pocket, Mori continued. Did you find anything else? Something about a war? Dazai blinked, scratching the back of his head where no longer human was a near-silent, constant buzz. Non-magic resources could only tell me so much, you know. Once I figure out where they keep their documents, I can tell you anything you want. Well, I don't think you'll have to worry about that. At his ward's annoyed look, the doctor chuckled. I've arranged for a Hogwarts representative to meet with you tomorrow. I'm sure you understand what would happen if this were to go poorly. Snapping shut the latch on his first aid kit, Mori beamed. Remember to act surprised. You've been practicing, right? You'd look so cute with a shocked expression. This time his kick didn't miss. Pretend like I don't know magic exists, Dazai thought, grinning over Mori's melodramatic whines. I'm still not convinced it does, idiot doctor. Snape's lip curled. Are you certain this is the correct place? The directory is never wrong, although, Dumbledore's eyes twinkled behind the panes of his glasses. It is curious that a name from Japan should appear on the list. For such an unusual case, it's best to visit personally. Populated streets. Perhaps lugging the half-giant around would have drawn too much attention. Snape knew he wasn't the type of person new students wanted to meet when being introduced to the magical community. He took great pride in that fact. Dumbledore gave him a pleasant, if cautious, look. Just so. Snape tried to restrain himself from sighing. Will you be enlightening me as to what makes this boy so unusual, then? He ground out. Or do you intend to keep me in the dark until the boy's luggage is all packed aboard the train? With shining eyes, the old headmaster seemed to glow with a sort of excitement. Or maybe that was humor. Suddenly, he strode up to the front door, leaving Snape to grind his teeth and trail along. Dumbledore does a quick, silent charm in case any language barrier should arise. Apparently, this boy lived in a rather well-off apartment complex in the middle of Yokohama, Japan. Snape didn't know the first thing about the place, after all. Rarely did the magically created list of new students send them so far away. Grudgingly, he allowed himself to be tugged along by Dumbledore to the front entrance. The headmaster knocked 3 times. Not even 30 seconds passed before the door was swung open. Snape's lip twitched at the sight of the man on the other side. This character reeked on slimy condescension. Still, Dumbledore and this man wore matching smiles. Albus Dumbledore, he introduced himself. This is my associate, Professor Snape. I'm led to believe this is the home of Dazai Osamu. The man smiled wider. It's the sort of smile that puts Snape completely on edge, because the expression was sick with the tangible feeling of deception. The potion maker narrowed his eyes. Mori Ugai, he introduced. And yes, You'd be correct. May I ask why you're here? Snape shot Dumbledore a glare, but the headmaster didn't seem to care for the blatant scorn aimed his way. How peculiar. I'm certain you'd have received owls by now. The system is automated, after all. Owls. Perhaps, Snape growled. This conversation is best held indoors. I think that's best as well. Mr. Morey. Doctor, he corrected, come right in. He couldn't help but feel like the man is up to something. It's utterly ridiculous. The man is a muggle, after all, and one who didn't receive an owl in advance, if Snape heard correctly. There's positively no way this doctor can know what they'll have to say. Snape almost grins himself, imagining the shocked look Dr. Morey will give once they reveal the cause for this visit. Snape's first impression is that the apartment is incredibly bare and almost annoyingly clean. It's not the type of how he often sees when doing house visits. The presence of a child is completely scarce. If Snape didn't know any better, he'd say they'd accidentally went to the wrong address. Did anyone actually live here? Would you like some tea? Dumbledore hummed, looking all soft edges and pleasantries, just the sort of thing Snape couldn't bear. That would be lovely. No. Dr. Morey hummed, not offended in the slightest apparently. He disappeared around the corner and returned only a moment later with 1 cup of tea in hand. Snape's frown deepened when the doctor handed the solitary cup off to the headmaster. Something about how the man spoke rubbed him the wrong way. It was the sort of tone Lucius used. Slimy, his mind supplied without prompting. Ah, Dumbledore began. I'm pleased to inform you that your son has been accepted into Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Morey blinked, expression just stupefied enough for Severus to silently feel quite pleased. Snape cleared his throat. Perhaps you've noticed unusual things. Things that can't be explained. Except, where Severus usually is met with an expression like aghast realization, the doctor instead raised a brow. It's a look like he's privy to a private joke. Unusual things, Albus chuckled. He always hated this part. Muggles can be annoyingly persistent when it comes to understanding magic is real. Snape has had plates levitating around the room, while parents look on saying it must be windy. He settles in for a long evening. Damn Dumbledore for dragging him along to what so far appears to be a normal house call. It takes about 30 minutes to convince Dr. Morey that magic is in fact real, and that they are not planning an elaborate kidnapping of the man's son. Altogether, things went rather smoothly. Good. Maybe they can leave quickly and just be done. For whatever reason, Severus doesn't think that will be the case. Regardless, I'm sure our guests are tired of waiting. Introduce yourself. I'll be behind shortly. Rolling his eyes, Dazai hopped up from where he'd been sitting on his bed. Despite how long he sat there, the sheets didn't look remotely disturbed. While he walked to the living room, Dazai mentally went over the script he'd prepared in his head. Regular boy finds out he's magic. That was the play for today. Dazai would love to suck up to the school representatives, but all he really knows about this mission is that he needs to be at Hogwarts. For now, lying low is the safest best, even if it is the most boring one. Ah, well. He can probably make a little fun, right? He turned around the corner to the seating area. 2 pairs of eyes immediately tore away from each other to stare at him. Dazai watched as their eyes wandered up and down his frame, then back again, seeming to catch on how the bandages wrapped up his arms, legs, and neck. While they assessed him, Dazai took his turn to analyze them. The older man had a long white beard. This must be Dumbledore, Dazai thought idly. Certainly, the man fit his mental image of your stereotypical Merlin figure. The rundown Morey had given him suggested this Dumbledore character was some sort of big wizarding figure, the type who had his hands in wizard politics for sure. Definitely someone to be cautious around. At Dumbledore's side was a thin, greasy man with longish black hair. He seemed like a prickly sort of person at first glance, but Dazai could see there was something more beneath the surface. The fact that he couldn't immediately tell what this man was hiding meant 2 things. 1, he was someone to keep an eye on, and 2, Dazai didn't know nearly enough about the wizarding world. Being so out of his depth put him on edge. That, and being caged in by 2 strangers, at least he knew Morey was probably poking around somewhere nearby. I'm Dazai, he greeted, beaming easily, even though the name caught on his tongue. I hear something about a school? Sounds boring. Dumbledore's laugh was like the twinkling of stars or rustle of feathers. The greasy-looking man, however, seemed to grow even more stern. My name is Albus Dumbledore. This is Professor Snape. We've come to congratulate you on your acceptance to Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. Wizardry? He paused, as if considering the answer. Dazai put on his best innocent child expression. He'd been practicing. The way his lips curved into a pout was only easy after so many hours spent staring into a mirror, pulling at his face. Seems a bit absurd, probably scheming. Honestly, Dazai was almost wondering the same himself. Being alone in a room with two adult strangers outside of his realm of influence was enough to set Dazai's spine ramrod straight. His only consolation was that Mori was probably around here somewhere. Again, Dumbledore just smiled pleasantly. And really, Dazai hated having to sit around and have trivial details regurgitated at him. Still, he hummed and nodded along at all the right moments. While the headmaster went off about his school and about all he has to learn, Dazai busied himself with wondering what sort of spells might be lethal. There's probably a spell for summoning water, right? Could he summon some right into his lungs, like drowning without all the work of finding a suitable bridge? When the headmaster cleared his throat, Dazai forced himself away from his morbid contemplations. He blinked up with an expression like he wasn't already bored at the prospect of school either way. Dumbledore and Mori seemed to see through it. Severus will be back in 1 week to take you for school supplies. Until then, Dazai really wanted to ask about the killing curse. Nope, he grinned boyishly. Dr. Mori, who had come back 5 minutes earlier claiming he'd had to take a phone call, placed his hand on Dazai's head and ruffled his fluffy hair a bit. Dazai tried not to pout, but it was a losing battle, really. At least it was better than the flinch he had actually managed to hold back. Well, I think that will be all then, he hummed. I trust Dazai will be in safe hands. Mori said it like a threat, Dazai noted with idle humor. The doctor must have read his thoughts, because he chuckled lightly. Regardless, I do have to get back to work now. I'll be back in a week to hear how your shopping trip went with Professor Snape. Do try not to kill yourself until then. 2 across the ocean. Dazai shot up and opened the door. On the other side, Severus's dull, greasy expression was the perfect counterpart to Dazai's vigor. The professor's eyes wandered around the front room momentarily. I don't see your guardian anywhere. It's just me today, actually. Snape raised a brow, but otherwise didn't look bothered by the announcement. More than that, he just looked annoyed to have to even be there. Well, Dazai could work with that. After all, Mori had basically told him he could do whatever he wanted. Really, Dazai had spent a good amount of time considering and reconsidering just who this Snape fellow was in preparation for today's trip. Unlike last time, he didn't plan on being the only person present not knowing all the players in the game. He knew Snape was tricky. There was definitely something below the surface level going on him, but it didn't seem to be a threat at the moment. Dazai took momentary reprieve in the fact that he could probably overpower Snape if he really needed to. That Dumbledore guy. Dazai wasn't sure about him. He was bringing a knife just in case. Come on then, Severus growled. I'd like to finish up with you as early as possible. Don't you like me? Dazai grinned harmlessly. In return, Snape sent him a seething glare. He grabbed the collar of Dazai's button-up and practically shoved him out the door. Dazai frowned at the rough treatment, but it was hardly something he wasn't used to. Snape began speed-walking down the street. Dazai skipped after him without complaint. Future student. Ah, what a reassuring correction. Then does that make Snape my future professor? Dazai asked, a dangerous gleam in his eye. However, Severus immediately halted in his tracks. He spun on his heels and bent down to glare directly into Dazai's eyes. That is no excuse not to respect your betters, boy. Dazai tried to restrain himself from rolling his eyes. It seemed the rough disposition and disrespectful demeanor only applied. To Snape himself, people, adults especially, were so hard to understand. Well, not really. But he sure did find their temperamental hypocrisy annoying. Yes, sir. Snape blinked. Dazai didn't think he expected such a half-hearted acquiescence to the verbal assault. The man cleared his throat and straightened back up. Good. After only a moment of silence, Dazai's upset over his lack of knowledge on the subject of magic got the best of him. So, where are we going anyway? Diagon Alley. He snapped. Can't you go even 1 minute without blathering on? Nope, Dazai said, popping the pea noisily. How are we getting there? You can probably teleport, right? When Severus only continued walking faster, the young mafioso chirped. Or fly on a broom. Unless you plan to walk across an ocean, that is. That's too exhausting. I think I'll just drown. Drowning, the professor spat, is hardly an acceptable response to slight hardship, boy. Walking across an ocean is only slightly difficult for you, and we will be taking a bus. No more questions. Ah. So they're taking a bus across the ocean. Somehow that didn't really clear things up. Regardless of the specifics, Dazai could reason they'd be taking some sort of magical transportation system in the form of public transit. It was almost exciting. Finally, he'd be getting some of his curiosity sated. Ugh, Dazai hates being out of the loop. He wondered what this Diagon Al place was like. When Dazai had tried to research the magical world, he'd mostly come up blank. A few articles here, a book or two there. Everything he'd managed to scrounge up was vague and predictable. It felt like reading information that had been so unimportant, it had managed to slip through the highly discriminative hands of the magical bureaucracy without much concern. Dazai felt a small trill of excitement. Suddenly, Severus came to a halt. When Dazai nearly stumbled into him, the dark-haired man smirked. He reached into his pocket, withdrew a wand, and stuck it out as though hailing a cab. Dazai blinked. Normally, the professor said at the bemused expression, the night bus doesn't leave Britain. Hogwarts has made a special request for you, so I expect you to behave. Before he can reply, something catches Dazai's attention. Without realizing, his mouth gapes open slightly. A large triple-decker bus came bouncing down the street at breakneck speeds. Just when he thought it would go shooting past them, the night bus came to an abrupt stop directly in front of Snape's wand. The doors opened slowly, mechanically. Snape retracted his wand and stepped onto the bus. Are you planning to gawk all day, boy? With a grin, Dazai shook his head and skipped in beside his guide. Nope, it's just, he hummed, looking all around the bus curiously as he followed Snape towards the back. Making a bus taller and faster seems like an odd thing to magic. Haven't you guys figured out teleportation yet? Severus took a seat near the back of the bus and shot Dazai a glare. He waited until the boy had taken the seat beside him to reply. As a courtesy to you, he spat, we are taking the bus. For someone so unfamiliar with magic as yourself, boy, apparition would be incredibly uncomfortable. Apparition, huh? Still, Dazai smiled pleasantly on cue. Ah, thanks then. Anything he wanted to say next was stolen from his throat when the night bus started to move. Now at most, Dazai has ridden in the back of mafia cars. They're black and long and very, very controlled. Even driving over bodies, you can hardly feel the bumps. In contrast, the night bus, immediately upon starting, drove like... Well, Dazai wasn't sure what to compare it to. All he knew was that his fingers were dyed white, with how tight he grabbed the seat to stop from falling, and how heavy his headache was building. The bus peeled down the street, faster than Dazai thought was reasonable, and with each blink he took it shot from one road to the next. Snape raised a brow at his charge's tense frame. Dazai pretended he didn't notice the way the man's lips twitched upwards. This is a pub. Snape barely glanced down at him, already abandoning the bus in favor of heading toward the doors. I mean, I wouldn't mind a drink, but isn't that irresponsible of you? Shut up. Dazai's mouth clamped shut with a snap. He peeked up at Snape through long, cinnamon bangs. The professor sighed, sounding as though dealing with Dazai were a form of advanced torture. The Leaky Cauldron, the entrance to Diagon Alley, where you will be buying your supplies for this year. He relented. Dazai made an appreciative noise. When Snape opened the pub's door, he followed in obediently. The place wasn't especially busy, although even a few people Dazai was unfamiliar with was enough to put him on edge. The shabby atmosphere didn't do much to help with that feeling, but Snape didn't seem worried so much as annoyed. Severus made a gesture in greeting to some of the staff. No, the Leaky Cauldron wasn't very busy. This was probably the only reason Dazai noticed the person loitering in the back corner. The man wore a turban and had a stuttering frame, like he wasn't sure he had a right to be there. Dazai's nose scrunched up. This stranger gave him a bad feeling. A feeling like you were looking at someone with no moral standards. But then again, Dazai was pretty sure he gave off the same, I'm a threat, stay away from me aura as this fellow. Maybe he was the wizard version of Mafia. The man looked up with wide, startled eyes. He seemed to recognize the feeling of a fellow monster's eyes on him. Dazai gave him a thumbs up. Solidarity. Dazai turned to see Snape's glower. Looking around, Professor walked to face a brick wall. He pulled out a wand. Wow, a brick wall. What did I say? Using the wand, Snape tapped along the bricks. Dazai stared in rapt attention as the bricks began to slide and rearrange themselves until something resembling a doorway was left in, place of the wall. At once, the bricks stopped moving. Bouncing on his heels, Dazai peeked out from under Snape's arm. On the other end of the wall was a bustling street that Dazai was fairly sure didn't make sense with the layout of the city they were just in. The sheer number of people he could see just by. Standing in the leaky cauldron made Dazai feel a little dizzy, but Snape was quick to urge him into Diagon Alley regardless. Behind them, the wall closed back up. Snape set off at a quick pace. Dazai immediately made to follow, but he stumbled a bit trying to keep pace. He was 2 steps for every one of Snape's. It was too crowded. There was no way he could keep track of every single person around. The air breathed with constant threat. Or, no. Well, Dazai was on edge from all the people around. But there was something else in the air, too. Like a quiet buzz in the back of his skull, the air seemed alive. It made his brain itch, as if no longer human was in effect. Dazai glanced up at Snape, but the man didn't seem to notice how the air was practically alive with energy. Questions for another time. For now, Dazai just wanted to get somewhere quiet. He skipped ahead a few steps to half-run side by side with Snape. The man barely sent him a passive glance at the change in pace. It was barely another minute before their destination became apparent. The huge white building before Dazai would have the honor of being the grandest thing he'd ever seen. Had the Mafia's skyrise not been so oppressively towering. Still, he supposed by magical standards, the place was rather interesting. Dazai spared a glance to Snape. What is that place? It's where we're going, right? Severus glared down at him, as though curiosity was something to be deterred. With a pleasant smile, Dazai tried and failed to see the problem with gathering information. Regardless of his clear displeasure, the professor grunted. Gringotts Bank. You brought money, didn't you, boy? Yes, sir. Grabbing the boy's arm, Snape growled lowly and forced Dazai toward the bank. He didn't seem to notice how Dazai stiffened under the grip. Yes, and you'll do well not to spout such nonsense in their faces. Now. He pushed his charge through an ajar door. Behave. Dazai's eyes widened minutely. For all intents and purposes, it was just a regular bank, if a bit ornate. Except behind the desks and scattered about working studiously were what Dazai could only assume were the goblins Snape had mentioned. He'd never seen a magical creature before. Granted, the concept of abilities had somewhat desensitized him to such absurdities. Still goblins. What other sort of creatures existed? He wanted to meet an omen of death. Rocking back on his heels, Dazai rummaged around his coat pocket before pulling out 3 pristine $100 bills. Not a wrinkle in sight, Dazai noted with pleasure. Someone cleared their throat, and he tried not to startle at the closeness. Snape glared down at him, lip curled. We haven't got all day, boy. Shuffling a foot away from the professor, Dazai made a small sound of agreement. When he started towards one of the bank tellers, Snape trailed a step after him. He stopped about a foot away from a particularly mean-looking teller. At the dull look the goblin gave him, Dazai merely grinned. He set the bills down on the counter, with a certain flair usually reserved for more interesting tasks. You can exchange this for me, can't you? He asked. The teller pulled a face, nose scrunching up like he was looking at something unpleasant. He didn't reach for the money. Dazai glanced up to Snape with a look that silently conveyed, Am I supposed to do something else? When it became apparent the goblin was content to simply glare down at Dazai, Snape cleared his throat. The professor placed his hand on the money and slid it further across the desk, wearing a look like he was at the end of his rope. To Dazai's surprise, the goblin immediately nodded and set to work. The work was quick and efficient. A small pouch of coins was placed in front of Snape, was a click barely a moment after. When Dazai reached out to take them, the goblin's hands quickly pulled back and hid themselves away behind the counter. Magical creatures are strange, Dazai thought. He peeked inside the bag, frowning down at the collection of coins he couldn't recognize. The coins jangled noisily in the pouch when he shut it. Dazai blinked up at Snape, commenting idly. I don't think they like me. Snape glared down at him, but there was something contemplative in that gaze. Without a word, he walked towards the exit. "No, enough," Snape barked. "And hurry up, we need to get your supplies quickly." Dazai nodded, serious. "So you can accomplish your secret mission, so I can get back to work without you tagging along like a leech. 3 wands, CW, self-harm, blood." Dazai squinted down at his supplies list before folding it back up and sticking it in his coat. He smiled emptily at the building Snape had stopped in front of. "Ollivanders?" He hummed. "That's wands?" Snape shot him a scathing look, but that sort of anger wasn't as impressive compared to the Mafia members Dazai was familiar with. For now, however, he didn't mind going along with the professor's whims. Until he had some more concrete research on magic, following orders was a safer play. He would make even better decisions if Mori would just tell him what in the hell the plan was. "Bastard." "Right," Dazai hummed. "I'll just go in then." He almost expected Snape to scamper off, but the man followed only a half step behind. Dazai must have made a curious expression at that, because Snape sighed. "It seems I can't trust you to shop on your own," he hissed. "Besides, the idea that any wand would willingly put up with you boggles the mind. It's not my fault the goblins don't like me. Probably. Wait, does that mean the wands are sentient?" Snape shot him another look just as they opened the door and entered the shop. Immediately, Dazai was greeted by towering shelves, filled from end to end with small boxes. He blinked up at what he presumed to contain wands with a look of awe, usually reserved for things of particular interest. So these were the items that allowed people to manipulate magic. He'd love to crack one open and see what made it work, if only just to have something to do in this tedious world. Dazai reached out to take one off the shelf. "Excuse me." An older-looking man suddenly appeared directly to Dazai's left. Not having heard him approach, Dazai startled and pulled his hand back with a hiss. "Ollivander." Snape greeted with a passive grunt over his shoulder. "Severus." The wandmaker smiled. "It's not often you come to my shop. I trust your wand is still in working order?" "Indeed." He stuck his chin out. "Unfortunately, a foreign muggle-born requires more delicacy than our groundskeeper can manage, so I have the task of delivering him around Diagon Alley. I suppose Hagrid does tend to make a scene." "A wand for the boy, then?" Snape made a noise from his throat. With a nod, Ollivander spun on Dazai. His eyes were narrow and assessing in a way that made Dazai's spine snap a bit straighter. Still, he was familiar with heavy attention like this enough to school his expression. Dazai blinked sluggishly at the older man, offering an expression perfectly dull. For his part, Ollivander only continued to study him, a look like optimistic interest in his eyes. After a moment of silent staring, Severus cleared his throat loudly. Ollivander nodded abruptly. "Your wand hand?" A bit off guard at the non-sequitur, Dazai held out his right hand. The old wand-maker probably meant dominant hand, and while that technically meant he could use either hand, Dazai was eager to get a move on. Ollivander's eyes held nearly the same level of cryptic calculation of Mori's, and that meant all his secrets were easily fair game. Without warning, a long stick was being shoved into Dazai's hand. He stared at it for a moment before looking back to Ollivander. "Walnut and dragon hairstring, 812 inches. Well, give it a wave, boy." He did. Despite how little he appreciated the lack of information, he had to admit he was curious. Giving the wand a swish and a flick, nothing happened. Not even a light nor a sound. Dazai frowned, waving again with a bit more force than necessary. "Not that one, then." Seeing how the boy pouted at his wand, Ollivander tried for a reassuring voice. Dazai didn't think he sounded all that convincing but couldn't place why. "We'll find a wand for you yet." He took the glorified stick back and immediately replaced it with another, apple wood and unicorn hair, then, gripping the wood firmly, Dazai gave another wave. Again, no response. The look in Ollivander's eyes, he didn't like that manic sort of eager. It was a look like he had found something quite fun to play with, not wasting another second. Another wand found its way into Dazai's hands. Then another, and another. From beside the door, Severus pinched the bridge of his nose. Nearly 3 hours later, and Dazai had effectively bled the wand shop dry. Wand after wand after wand, rendered useless in his hands. Ollivander rubbed his chin, frowning. Still, there was a glint in his eyes that made Dazai think the man was actually having quite a bit of fun. He supposed working in the same business for so long must get boring. With how much pressure Snape was using to rub at his head, Dazai thought the man's head might explode. He almost wanted to tell the man to just go home, but he was having his own fun driving the professor mad. Still, it was a useless endeavor to look for a wand. With no longer human the way it was, Dazai was nearly certain any of these so-called wands would become little more than useless twigs upon contact. He still wasn't entirely convinced he even had magic. Despite what Snape and Dumbledore and, hell, even Mori had said, Dazai still hadn't faced any proof whatever magic he had wasn't nullified. Dazai didn't really know what game Mori was playing, throwing him into the fire like this, annoying. He'd rather be hanging from a noose than be getting plunged into a world he knew nothing about. Squinting slightly at the wand maker, Dazai felt a headache building in the back on his brain. Ollivander scratched the bridge of his brow, expression tight. He easily ignored Dazai's tangent. It seems not. I've not had a case like this in decades. So? Snape barked. Am I expected to just bring the boy to Hogwarts without a way for casting spells? There's no wands and potions, right? Don't you want me to hang around? Snape shot him something like a glare, even though Dazai was trying his best to seem pleasant. Maybe the potions professor could already tell that Dazai was a slacker at heart. No, Ollivander interrupted, waving his hand. He cast a scrutinous gaze between the duo, eyes lingering for nearly a minute on Dazai's teasing expression. Well, maybe. It is strange, though. If I didn't know any better, I'd say you didn't have any magic at all. Dazai's eyes narrowed. About that wand, then. Right, of course. I'll have to make one custom just for you. Very exciting, really. Not very often a case like yourself comes around. He paused for a moment. 3 weeks, maybe 4. And I'll need something of yours, of course. Hair always does the trick. How about blood? Both Ollivander and Snape startled, blinking at the bandaged boy with twin expressions of something like shock. The wand maker dropped his hands midway through an exaggerated, demonstrative motion. For the core. Yes, I suppose that would do. Severus's lip twitched. Good. Dazai nodded, reassured. Hair. He wasn't sure about hair, but blood could easily act as an extension of his own body, especially if Dazai could figure out how to channel his magic into it. He was optimistic that if the wand contained blood from his still-beating heart, something might work. Even if that something was just him having a piece of wood filled with blood, while he was still positive this whole magic thing wasn't going to pan out. Well, he'd made a deal with Mori. Might as well try and get a functioning wand. Blood. Yes. I think it will do just nicely. The man considered him with an indecipherable look. I'll need a vial course. I don't suppose. A drop of blood fell to the floor. Snape was the first to react, rushing forward with an expression like stone. What are you doing? Without warning, he took hold of Dazai's arm and pressured the stab wound. At the sudden, unwanted contact, Dazai had to will himself not to flinch. Professor, aren't you listening? I'm getting blood. Snape frowned and gave the boy an indescribable blank look. Spurred into action, Ollivander abruptly vanished behind a row of shelves. He returned not a minute later with a small light blue cup. Dazai didn't waste a second to struggle out of Severus's grip, laying his hand an inch above the cup. Slowly, a thin trail of blood began to fill the cup. He could feel the other two's eyes bearing into him. That should be enough. The wandmaker said lightly, just as Dazai was starting to think he would need to cut again. Thank you. The man sent him a quiet, searching gaze. He must not have found his answer, because all the man did was rub at his chin like a person trying to solve a puzzle that was missing its corner pieces. Ollivander frowned, thoughtful. I'll send an owl when it's done. At his side, Snape growled and tore Dazai's arm back to him. Outside. Now. Huh? Shouldn't I pay him, sir? He smirked. Ollivander, who was staring into the depths of Dazai's blood pool before then, gave a mostly casual wave. Consider it free of charge. I've not had a challenge like this in some time. And the wait, after all. At the declaration, Snape didn't wait a moment longer. Gripping Dazai's arm with a white-knuckled fist, the professor dragged him out of the shop roughly, despite the rough treatment. The mafioso trailed behind with only a look of mild amusement. The second the door clicked shut behind them, Severus whirled around, staring directly into Dazai's eyes. What in the hell are you doing? He blinked, nonplussed. Getting blood? Wasn't that obvious? Severus moved to pinch the bridge of his nose, but seemed to think better of it when he realized there was blood on his hand. Don't be short with me, boy. Stabbing oneself is not the correct response to any situation. Do you understand me? Yes, sir. No. Clearly, Professor Snape wasn't a very well-versed individual, because Dazai could think of a number of situations in which stabbing himself might be beneficial. Easy access to his own blood was only one of many on that hypothetical list of merits. Dazai nodded, nonplussed by the overreaction. Severus's brows raised. Ah, shit. He should probably call Mori his dad, right? Oh well. Anyway, he transitioned fluently. I promise to behave the rest of the way. What's next on the list, sir? Again, the teacher's gaze simply hardened. Stay still. Snape's grip on the boy's bloody hand tightened, holding him in place. Without another word, he pulled out his wand. With renewed vigor, Dazai tugged his arm to get free. This only stood to make the wound tear a bit larger, however. He felt like a child, struggling against the man's harsh grip fruitlessly. Stay still, he repeated lowly. We still have shopping to do, and I won't have you dragging this on longer than it has to by bleeding out on the way. Ha! As if Dazai would be so lucky. He'd rather just wrap the cut in bandages, but, well, he was curious what it feels like to have magic used on him. At first, he wasn't sure that magic would even work around him, given no longer human. But the night bus didn't seem to have any problems. And there was that slight hint of magic buzzing in the air of Diagon Alley, too. That magic had been brushing up against him all day. So really, what's the harm? For some reason, it still seemed like a bad idea. Maybe he just didn't like Snape touching him. Regardless, Dazai didn't actually have a choice. He pulled a face, gave up on the pointless struggling, and offered a sheepish look instead. With a childish pout at where Snape's hand left a white mark on him, Dazai whined, Please be more gentle with me, sir. I'm fragile. Snape must not have cared for the display, because his scowl only deepened. Still, Dazai couldn't help but to perk up in interest when his professor raised a wand and pointed it to the wound. A pisky. Dazai stared down at the weeping wound, then blinked. That tingle of magic he'd felt buzzing in the air seemed to sing. The air began to feel thick around his arm where the wand was pointed. He waited to see the wound mend over, but after a second, that thick swell of magic vanished. He jerked Dazai's arm, forcing Dazai to take a stumbling step forward. For all his luster and charm, Dazai wasn't physically strong enough to not be tugged around like a rag doll. What did you do? Nothing. But I might stab you if you don't let go of me. Dazai's eyes narrowed, but he tried not to look quite as defensive as he felt by smiling. Didn't you say we were in a hurry? Anyway, it's already healing up. It wasn't. Not that it mattered. Dazai had been beaten, bruised, and shot at enough times to know when a wound was serious. Something like this wouldn't kill him. It wasn't deep enough, unfortunately. The glower on Snape's face didn't lessen. His lip pulled up in something like disgust blended with annoyance. I will not tolerate this disrespect at school, boy. Let's hope that bleeding out on the way to getting your books teaches you something about obedience. If bleeding out was this easy, he'd have done it ages ago. Regardless, Dazai couldn't help the pleased smile that crossed his face when Snape acquiesced. Unfortunately, he was sure the professor was also giving the situation some cautious thought, and Dazai didn't really like to be under the microscope like that. Book, sir? For the twins. The bookstore was crammed full of people. It was wall-to-wall books and back-to-back wizards. Dazai's breath caught in his chest as he struggled for something like an even breath. But the flat look on his face betrayed none of the tension in his spine. Dazai shot a quick glance at Snape. For whatever reason, once he saw the professor standing at his side, it was a little easier to pretend he wasn't sweating. Catching Dazai's eye, Snape's frown twitched. I have something to take care of, he said suddenly. Buy your books while I'm busy. Ha! Dazai gaped. He could feel the people all around them. Their mere presence made his skin crawl. Aren't you supposed to help me? The professor rolled his eyes. It's a bookstore. I'm sure even a child like yourself can figure it out. What makes you think that? I stabbed myself like 10 minutes ago. Severus clicked his tongue and put his hands on Dazai's thin shoulders with a grip like a raven's talons. Behave. Distantly, Dazai thought. This must be important. Amidst the foreign, tense atmosphere of a crowded place, at least the subvert threat in the professor's voice was familiar. As if he were a well-trained dog, Dazai nodded and breathed out a sigh. Don't fight back, his brain supplied easily over the buzz of energy in the air. That sort of mentality never failed him before. Good. Buy your books and do not leave the store. He turned and grabbed the door handle. And for Merlin's sake, don't stab yourself, boy. With that, he shut the door behind him. Dazai pouted at the doorway, watching as the shadow of his guide disappeared on the other side of the glass in the direction of Gringotts. How curious. What sort of business did the professor have that he would abandon his duties so easily? He'd just take his time browsing the books in the meantime. Sneaking out to spy on Snape now would just land him in trouble before the fun had even started. Anyway, ever since Mori told him to start researching the magical community, he'd been dying to pick up some of their literature. He hated to give them kudos, but wizards certainly knew how to keep their documents under wraps. Dazai glanced down at the pouch of foreign coins in his hand. He'd stolen some extra money from Mori before Snape had come to pick him up this morning. It was probably enough to buy everything on his list and then some. Information first, spying on Professor Snape later. Suddenly feeling a bit eager to be moving, Dazai skipped into the bookstore merrily. In his excitement to inspect all the books for sale, he could almost convince himself the place wasn't so crowded. Still, a deep breath and a focused head would help to pretend all these strangers weren't rubbing up against him in the aisles. He briefly skimmed the required book list. There were quite a few. At the very least, they'd be interesting for a beginner like himself. Still, it'd be prudent to save those ones for last. But before he grabbed the books he needed, Dazai wanted to look at some of the higher levels texts that weren't required. He scanned the shelves passively, gaze searching as the tomes grew thicker and more complex down the aisle. Travels with trolls, gadding with ghouls, holidays with hags. Were these written for children? Dazai passed them all with only a raised brow and the conscious thought of, I expected better. Once he got to the very back of the shop, however, he stopped. Confronting the Faceless, a guide to advanced transfiguration. Now these ones looked interesting. Honestly, why mess around with the beginner books when he'd probably be fine jumping ahead? Gathering as much information as possible was extra important, especially because Mori was so clearly hiding something from him. Bastard. Suddenly, Dazai's legs locked into place, his eyes blowing wide at the sight of a red-spined book poking out the shelf. The Complete Guide to Wizarding Suicide. He plucked it off the shelf like a bird snatching a mouse and flipped open to a page at random, eyes wide in anticipation. Wizarding Suicide. Dazai buzzed with barely concealed excitement. He couldn't wait to try. Well, a voice interrupted. A different voice finished. A young troublemaker? Shouldn't you be up front reading the kiddie books? Dazai whirled on his feet, tense and ready for something. He hadn't even heard them approach. He was so distracted with the books and with how many other people are crowded around. Dazai had stopped paying attention to each individual person. He could hear Mori berating him now. Waltzing down the aisle. 1, no, 2. People approached in a casual stride. They looked identical. When the tall, red-headed boys stopped about a foot from Dazai, they were each grinning ear to ear and wearing matching looks of mischief. Dazai blinked up at them, then smiled emptily. I'm being harassed. Is this bullying? Come on, we're just playing around. This time, it's the boys who were caught off guard. A suicide manual? The other wore an odd expression. That's meant to be for sale. Just my luck, then. Do you think it's free? For a moment, the boys shared a look. They seemed to come to a decision when one plucked a book from Dazai's hand, and the other put his hands on Dazai's shoulders, guiding him out from the back section. Flustered, Dazai let himself be pushed into the aisle for first-year books. Mom, the two brothers evidently yelled with one voice. We found a sad-looking kid. A plump-looking ginger woman turned from the shelf. Her eyes passed over the brothers, then Dazai with a look concern. Fred, George, what have I said about harassing other students? Let go of the poor boy, Fred. Come on, Mom. The boy Fred whined. Still, he took his hands from Dazai's shoulders. Dazai untensed easily and plastered on a pleasant smile. We're just making sure he's not lost. George chimed in. Then, with a frown, he added, he was looking at some weird book in the back. Fred nodded, enthusiastic. The woman's lip twitched down, and she gave Dazai a searching look. You're a first year, aren't you? Honey, all of your books should be up here. What's your name? You can call me Mrs. Weasley, she replied, looking pleasantly surprised by Dazai's manners. I assume the twins introduced themselves? Poor kid, George put a hand over his heart. What do you have to do to get stuck with him? Did Snape have a bad reputation at Hogwarts? He's the only teacher Dazai knew so far, probably by virtue of his being Muggle-born from Japan. Is he that bad? Is he that? Fred started. Yes, he's that bad. Absolutely terrible to every house except Slytherin. No fun at all. Takes pranks too seriously. Mrs. Weasley cleared her throat, looking every bit a reprimanding mother. Didn't I say not to prank teachers? No, I'm sure I've never heard that. Does that sound familiar, Fred? Not at all, George. She sighed and turned the attention back on Dazai, who had been snickering quietly to himself. Why don't you shop with us until Professor Snape comes back? I've got another son your age starting at Hogwarts this year too, Ron. What? Dazai blinked, stepping closer to a bookshelf as another red head appeared. This Ron character was a bit taller than him, Dazai noted with a pout. Oh, brows pinched together, he greeted. I'm Ron Weasley. Dazai. He waved and offered a pleasant smile in return. No reason to be hostile, really. Besides, he had some time until Snape got back. Having a loyal follower at Hogwarts would probably prove useful. Mrs. Weasley cleared her throat, turning back to the twins. We still have your brother's old copies for most of these, but this one here's new. She pointed at something on her list. Go off and find it now, boys, and don't harass any other students this time. Never, they chimed before vanishing out of sight. Dazai watched them go with an empty, bemused smile, of any student who talks in class. Oi! I'm trying to be nice. Wah! Friends are not the same things as dogs. Whatever. Dazai made a light humming noise, feeling vaguely triumphant, and reached out to run his finger over the book spines. Oh, right. He plucked the correct textbook from the shelf and smiled aimlessly. At the corner of his vision, Dazai noticed the twins return with their books. A gruesome tale. Maybe I shouldn't say, what? Ron paled. What happened? He hummed, pulling a face like he was lost in thought. Dazai paused to grab another book, if only just to leave Ron hanging for a moment longer. I was attacked, he said finally, speaking in a low, grim tone. There's a charming criminal wandering around with a knife, I guess. He's very handsome and is very talented with a knife. He asked if I wanted to commit a double suicide, and I was going to agree, but I was a little busy, so he stabbed me. Really? Why didn't you report it? Let's go tell my mom. I'm kidding. The twins burst out into laughter. There are dragons around here? Dazai interrupted, blinking amicably at George. Dazai waved them off. People were only ever good for overreacting. Back home, Maury would have just rolled his eyes and pulled out the bandages. Who knows? He replied evenly. There could be a stab-happy criminal around here. You wouldn't know. Ron raised a brow. So are you kidding or not? Beside him, Fred and George shared a look. Whatever passed between them, Dazai wasn't sure, but it wasn't a look of amusement. If only Dazai had someone he could silently communicate with like that. Maybe if he works on this Ron kid enough, he can have a subordinate that picks up on telepathic cues. 3 pairs of eyes blinked back at him. For you know, Dazai adds, a wand. Unless he's a vampire. Are vampires real? Yes, Ron answered. Don't you know that? Now that you mention it, Snape is pretty bat-like. Dazai reached for another book, only rolling his eyes when Ron suddenly startled. Wyatt, are you a muggle? You sound surprised. He snorted, then considered the question by glancing back at Ron. Is that such a bad thing? No. Well, George chuckled lightly. I mean, Dazai isn't exactly a well-known family name for wizards. Right. Didn't you notice, little brother? He could be from a well-known foreign family. At his twin's declaration, Fred put on the look of a hardened detective, leaning in close to Dazai's face. He's really upset about that muggle thing, Ickle Ronikins. Have you considered apologizing? What for? Dazai blinked. I'm not mad. Then what are you doing? He waved them off, sighing too loud and shrugging off to the other bookshelf. Never mind. They'll have to work on it. Or maybe this subordinate is no good. Either way. Here's my last book. Wait. Dazai quirked his head sideways. You can't just say Ollivander wanted your blood and leave it at that. Ron gasped. That's not a normal thing. For a wand. Fred and George chuckled. Your new friend is mysterious, Ron. Grinning sloppily, Dazai allowed himself a small laugh at the Weasleys' antics. He opened his mouth to speak when a shadow suddenly fell over him. Immediately, Ron straightened and cleared his throat. At his side, the twins also perked up. Dazai himself felt a breath catch in his throat and his mouth go cold. Who? Professor, Fred greeted. How lucky we are to see you here today. Indeed, Snape replied in a low voice, looking down at Dazai. I see you didn't wander off. Dazai glanced up faux lazily, brow raised and still reeling from being caught off guard. He lifted the books mutely. Did you finish your secret side quest, sir? What did I say about asking questions? Right, Dazai hummed. 5 Angel. CW, Maury being a creep. Dazai whined, rolling onto his back and tossing a textbook aside. Please, I'm begging you. Shut up for 5 minutes. Hoot. I'm trying to focus, you know. Hoot, hoot. Dazai pouted when the owl only continued to clean itself. I don't even need an owl. Aren't you just here to make reading difficult then? Actually, the owl is how we'll be communicating, Dazai. Please refrain from killing it. Maury waved amicably at the doorway. Even worse, Dazai said, picking his book back up. When did you get back anyway? I see you're wearing one of the dresses I got for you. The doctor said, completely disregarding the annoyed glare Dazai sent him at being ignored. I'll admit I'm a bit surprised. Usually I have to force you into such cute outfits. I'm just being proactive. Maury raised a brow. Dazai noted with a frown that the doctor looked amused regardless. Oh, how's that? I'm skipping the part where you asked to dress me up and I try to stab you in the thigh. Maury hummed. But you don't try to stab me when we play dress-up. Dazai rolled his eyes. That takes a lot of self-control. He looked away, glaring 2 angry holes into the owl. I'm too tired for that right now, so I won't be holding back if you try anything. Thank you for your consideration. He cleared his throat. So? How was your day trip with that professor? The owl hooted. Look who it is. Snape's favorite student is here. Dazai knew those voices. He glanced away from the bustling station, squinting at the large print 9 and 10 with a pout. Fred, George, fancy seeing you here. Fred chuckled. Been standing here a while, actually. Mom's getting emotional about sending Ron off. Only one kid left, after him. Dazai glanced behind the twins, where Mrs. Weasley fussed over Ron, mussing up his hair and holding him tight. The mafioso snorted at the affectionate gesture. Is Snape not with you again? The twins laughed. After a second, they started walking back towards the other Weasleys, so Dazai followed with a lazy gait. Hello, Mrs. Weasley. Ron, the mafioso greeted. Oh, hello, dear. When she pulled off of Ron, the boy shot Dazai a look like he had just parted the sea. Have you got all your things? Yes, ma'am, Dazai beamed. Ron took a quick few steps toward Dazai until they were side by side. He shot a wary glance toward Mrs. Weasley's open arms. Great. Dazai here's been very worried about getting a seat on the train, so we'll be going now. I have been? Yes. Bye, Mom. Bye, Ginny. Finally, Ron pulled open a compartment door and promptly fell into an empty seat. Thanks, man, he said, breathing heavily. Dazai set his things down and took the seat across from Ron with practiced casualness. He blinked. For helping you avoid your family? No problem. Yeah. Mom can be really overbearing sometimes. And don't get me started on those hideous sweaters. Sweaters? Dazai fished around his suitcase for a book. After a moment of silent consideration, he pulled magical drafts and potions onto his lap. Maybe he could brew a poison to drink. Every Christmas. Ron whined. He watched Dazai flip through the book before saying, Are your folks not like that then? Ron pulled a face. That's right. They weren't at Diagon Alley either. Dazai waved off the suspicion with a stray hand. Morty's busy and I can't stand him, so it's not a big deal. Right. Rotten luck getting stuck with Snape then. Ron said, expression taut like wire. You call your dad by his name? Sure, one shows up and won't leave my side. Dad said I didn't need an owl since Angel is so attached to me. Angel? It's just a regular owl. Noisy thing. Right. Ron shot him an almost disappointed look. Well, that's you, I guess. You get that arm looked at? Mom was worried sick when the twins and I told her. All healed up, unfortunately. Unfortunate? Sure, Dazai said, drumming his fingers on the potions book with an amiable smile. Bleeding out seems like a pleasant way to die. Unfortunately, the wound wasn't fatal. Ron blinked, then blinked again. You can't want to die. His nose scrunched up, creasing a wrinkle into his brow. You're joking, right? A pure, cheerful, and energetic suicide. Those are the words I live by. Ron's mouth opened to say something. Probably something tedious, Dazai thought mutely. However, before the pale boy could say anything of worth, the compartment door slid open. Anything off the trolley, dears? Dazai blinked up lazily to see a gentle-looking woman at the doorway. She was pushing a cart filled to full capacity with sweets. No thanks. I'm all set, Ron replied. Despite his polite demeanor, however, Dazai noted a distinct melancholy in the way he held his packed lunch. Puffing out of breath, Dazai rooted around in his pockets for coins. I'll take something. Hey Ron, what's good here? Anything but Bertie Bott's every flavor beans. George reckons he had a bogey-flavored one once. Don't talk. Catch it. Suddenly, the frog bounded off of Dazai's lap, hopping directly onto Ron's shoulder. The ginger flailed. Despite both boys reaching for the chocolate, it was Angel who caught it, trapped beneath two flimsy, skeleton-thin paws. The black rat blinked lazily down at its captive prey. Hey, get off that. That isn't yours, stupid rat. He shook his head, pulling a face. Ah, never mind, you can keep it. I don't know where that rat of yours has been. Are you sure, mate? Ron beamed, prying the chocolate out from underneath Angel by giving the rat a flick on its side. In his grip, the frog went limp. They only really have one good hop in them. He explained, popping it into his mouth with a certain glee. Tanks. What cas de je? What on earth are you saying? Ron swallowed the chocolate down and cleared his throat. What card did you get? Chocolate frogs come with a collectible, Dazai sighed, somehow managing to keep the disgusted look off his face. Before Ron could be a good subordinate, he'd have to learn a few manners first. Until then. He picked the frog's container up and squinted down at it. Oh, that old guy is here. Dumbledore, Ron corrected, voice pitching a bit. I've got about 6 of him. Want to make it 7? No. Has anyone seen a toad? Dazai's playful expression froze in place when a third voice interrupted from the doorway. At the entryway, a young girl with thick, curly hair frowned down at them, eyes searching. At his side, Dazai noticed Ron shoot him a peeved look at the interruption. Ron's face scrunched up. No. Dazai shrugged, trying for a passive look. He was starting to think he'd been too quick to judge his stupid owl as a bad pet if everyone else was going around with rats and toads. Still, are you sure he's just not seeing it? I bet toads are a quiet, respectable pet, the type that doesn't hoot when you're trying to read. The girl's eyes widened somewhat, landing on the open book on Dazai's lap. Getting ahead in your studies? I've already read through all the first-year books, you know, but I guess it can't hurt to start now. Grinning, she stuck out her hand. I'm Hermione Granger. And who are you two, then? Ron Weasley, the redhead said, taking her hand and shaking it. Despite the pleasantry, he wore an expression closer to annoyance than anything else. You like to commit a double suicide with me, my lady? What? Ron chuckled under his breath, and Hermione scrambled back into the doorway. He's joking, he clarified, smiling with a pinched expression. You're joking, right? I mean, he's joking, Ron said again more harshly this time. You shouldn't joke about things like that, Dazai. Besides, it's not right to tease a girl like that. She'll be fine. Besides, I thought she might appreciate a grand, romantic gesture. That's how you make friends, isn't it? You can't be serious. Dazai shrugged. He took the book from his lap and returned it to his suitcase with a certain regret at not being able to read it. Now that he thought about it, Ron was really no better than his owl, right? Neither would shut up when he was trying to work. At least his owl could deliver mail, although the messages would be from Maury, so maybe Ron was the superior pet. Brushing off Ron's befuddled gaze, the bandaged boy rustled around in his suitcase until he could find his school robes. Seeming to take that as a cue to get moving, Ron stood. Angel's little claws tightened on Ron's sleeve at the sudden movement, drawing a snort from Dazai. A toad, Dazai hummed, glancing at the black rat. Almost as useless as a rat. Angel stared at him with amethyst eyes that almost looked humored. Somehow, Dazai was almost convinced the black rat was smiling. "Want to trade? I'll take your owl, you take Angel?" "No way. Besides, I refuse to call that thing an angel. It's glaring at me, see?" Ron blinked, twisting his neck to get a better look. "What do you want about? He's dumb, not evil." "I don't know. It definitely stepped on that chocolate frog just so I couldn't have any." "Right." 6. The Sorting Hat. It's not practical. And really, it's not. Ever since he put the damn thing on, Dazai had been imagining all the different ways wearing a cloak was more of a hazard than anything else. For instance, what if he's running away from someone? It would be too easy for them to grab at his cloak and drag him back. When he tried explaining this to Ron, however, his no-good subordinate in training had only replied with, "Why are you planning to be chased?" "Just calm down, mate. It's hard to find a good subordinate these days." Ron rolled his eyes, all but pushing Dazai off the train. It was dark when they unboarded, and Dazai silently mourned how much time he wasted talking to his classmates instead of gathering information. Still, when he hopped off the train a step ahead of Ron, Dazai couldn't help but feel a tickle of excitement shoot up his spine. It's a strange feeling, and not one he'd ever want to voice aloud. Dazai doesn't really get out much. For maybe the first time in forever, his bedroom door is unlocked and no one is watching his every move. Mori wants him here for a reason, of course, but that old doctor isn't here now, so there's nothing wrong with enjoying this freedom a bit, right? It's not like anyone back home has to know that for maybe the first time in forever, Dazai is feeling a positive emotion. "Whoa!" Dazai blinked back to attention, immediately tracking Ron's awed voice to the hulking figure before them. The man stood more than twice Dazai's height and 3 times as wide. Right then, the man boomed, startling some of the students around them. "First years, this way, please." Feeling rather pleased with himself for not flinching at the shout, Dazai barely noticed Ron shoot him an eager grin. Ron immediately trailed after the large fellow who had called for them like a dog to its master. With a raised brow, Dazai followed his subordinate lamely. "This way to the boats. Follow me." "Boats?" Dazai half whispered to Ron. The redhead shrugged, bounding along the path. "We take boats across the lake to school." "It's what I hear." After a quick look to Dazai, he added, "Just the first years, though. My brother said after that we take horseless carriages over." As he spoke, Ron seamlessly guided he and Dazai into a rickety old boat. Dazai regarded the thing critically before shrugging and taking his seat. If it broke apart and they drowned, well, that wasn't really a bad thing, right? Anyway, a quick glace to that large, bearded fellow proved the boats could handle a little weight. Dazai was almost disappointed to realize they wouldn't be drowning this afternoon. Wishful thinking. He didn't voice this thought aloud, however. Mori had warned him against being too obvious about his willingness to die, and although Dazai couldn't care less about what that man had to say, he did see the merit in hanging around a bit longer. At the very least, he wanted to enjoy just one day without some mafioso breathing down his neck. An orange-looking lantern laid out on the boat, and Dazai mindlessly took it and held it over their heads. It wavered only slightly when 2 complete strangers boarded the boat behind them. Actually, not strangers. The busy-haired girl from earlier was there. Their eyes met, shining in the swing of his lantern. "Oh, you don't mind if we sit here, do you? This is Neville Longbottom. I told you about him earlier." A quiet look passed between him and Ron, and Dazai got the impression the redhead didn't appreciate Hermione's appearance. Dazai waved him off with a bandaged hand. "Fellow with the lost toad, yeah?" He hummed. You've seen Trevor?" No, I was just thinking. Is that a good pet? I bet it's not as annoying as an owl." Neville stared at him, wide-eyed. Without warning, Ron elbowed him in the side, earning him a pout. Dazai put a hand on his side, whining, "What was that for?" "Never mind that, look." Dazai stared out over the water as the towering castle came into view. Hogwarts was a castle. Okay, that was kind of cool. Oppressive towers and peaks made the horizon, lit only by 1,000 open windows. This sort of place was nothing like the cityscape of Yokohama. It was a strange, rustic place, and Dazai felt like he was sailing into the distant past, a place of kings and queens. Still, Dazai was nothing if not an expert at schooling his expression, and for some reason gaping open-mouthed seemed like a concession. So Dazai kept his face carefully blank, sparing only the briefest looks of curiosity at such a magical sight. Suddenly, Dazai felt the base of his skull buzz with energy. Was no longer human activating? He didn't think anyone was using an ability on him. But this had happened at Diagon Alley too, hadn't it? Something about the air itself was alive with the same power as an ability. Maybe this Hogwarts trip would be interesting, even with Mori's stupid secret plan at play. Dazai breathed out a silent sigh, feeling the beginnings of a headache come on. He was almost relieved when they finally docked on the other side of the lake, if only just because seeing the other students so awed by Hogwarts was distantly annoying. Tossing the lantern aside, Dazai readjusted quickly to having solid earth below him once again. Beside him, Ron, Hermione, and Neville stumbled a bit at the difference. Ron shot him a not-so-subvert glare when Dazai offered nothing more than a chuckle as help. Off you go, then. Their guide waved two large hands toward what Dazai assumed to be the school entrance. Head up the stairs and Professor McGonagall will see you to the Great Hall for sorting. His boatmates shared eager looks and hurried after the crowd. Dazai ambled after them lazily, propping his arms up behind his head and offering a passive look. A few steps behind them, Dazai took his time up the stairs, mutely wondering over the ornate stairway. Abruptly, the trio he was following came to a stop. Dazai glared at the backs of their heads when he stumbled a bit. That's what he gets, for letting his mind wander. At least none of these other punks bumped into him. Blinking around Ron's back, Dazai finally understood why they had stopped. An older-looking woman stood at the top of the stairs. She wore a long cloak and a pointed hat that Dazai felt was a bit excessive, and between her crossed hands was a long, pointed wand. "Welcome to Hogwarts," the professor called in a voice cracked with age and wear. "Now, in a few moments you will pass through these doors and join your classmates. But before you can take your seats, you must be sorted into your houses." Ron looked to his side as if to say something, but instead found himself looking at the banister. He offered a startled look to the rail before sighing and stepping half a pace to the right. "Dazai," he yelled, "why are you back there?" A glare from McGonagall stole the protestation from Ron's mouth. A few nervous chuckles filled the air around them at the silent scolding, and Dazai watched in vague amusement as the red head withdrew into himself slightly. "They are Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff." Her voice took on a dangerous edge. "And Slytherin." The houses, Dazai had done the barest amounts of research on them. He didn't have a mind for arbitrary divisions, however. He got the impression house loyalties were very important to some of these other brats. At the end of the day, Dazai's loyalty could never lie with any of these houses, or even Hogwarts for that matter. But none of these kids had to know he was only loyal to the Mafia. Besides, he thought clarifying that was probably more trouble than it was worth. After that, Dazai stopped paying attention. Instructions were boring. It was just schooling anyhow, so Dazai didn't anticipate being too out of his depth. Instead, he let his mind wander. That tickling feeling in his brain hadn't settled. If anything, it had gotten more noticeable. He was sure of it. Magic and abilities must be fundamentally the same concepts. No longer human was working itself too hard, trying to nullify all of the potent energy in the room, with the same force it would if he were touching an ability user. Honestly, it was all a bit tiring. Unfortunately, Dazai was nearly convinced that magic was some sort of non-localized ability. He'd probably just have to get used to it. All the more evidence towards Dazai's theory that he could not in fact utilize magic. Stupid Mori. Dazai was distantly aware of that long-bottom kid finding his toad. Much to Dazai's displeasure, the annoying little thing was making an obnoxious series of squeaking croaks. So much for a quiet pet. There's no such thing as a good pet, probably. They're all horrible. Little things and wizards should learn how to use a cell phone. Oi, we're going in. Dazai turned a lazy glare to Ron, who elbowed him sharply in the side. "I'm going to bruise if you keep that up. If you're going to hit me, at least be trying to kill me." Ron rolled his eyes, taking a hold of Dazai's sleeve and tugging him up the final stair and through two large open doors. "We're about to be sorted. Aren't you excited? I've got to be in Gryffindor, you know. Where do you reckon you'll be?" Dazai felt his mouth clamp shut at the whispered command. It was probably for the best anyway, considering Ron was about to explain a terrorist organization to him on the way to the Great Hall. Once the Great Hall came into view, even Dazai couldn't pretend he wasn't a little excited. Candles floated in the air, held aloft by nothing by what must have been magic. Above them, the ceiling wasn't a ceiling at all. Instead, it was a clouded night sky. Dazai almost made to ask why he couldn't feel a breeze if the roof was open, but on closer inspection could faintly see the beams and bars of a peaked ceiling. Was it a spell? What a useless thing to magic up, although in the end, Dazai could recognize the view as somewhat impressive. McGonagall led her group to a complete stop at the front of the massive room just before. A hat? Dazai briefly let himself inspect the beat-up old hat before passing his eyes over the bigger threat. Up against the far wall was a long, horizontal table packed tightly with adults. Dazai picked Dumbledore and Snape out amongst the 15 or so other people up there, and deduced those must be other professors and staff. Oh, that guy from the leaky cauldron with the turban was here too, small world. Seeing them all lined up, Dazai squared his shoulders and felt his hands go a bit cold. He didn't like the idea they were watching him. Clearly, they were more experienced in magic than him. That made them dangerous, a threat. That buzzing feeling in his skull persisted, but now it was screaming, "Get out, get out, get out, get out, get out, get out." Dazai stuck his heels in the floor and bit his cheek. Ron elbowed him in the side again, but his brows were drawn together tightly in an expression Dazai didn't bother to identify. His side stinging, Dazai suddenly found his head clearing a bit. He shouldn't be so afraid. Dazai didn't do afraid. Still, he couldn't deny that odd sort of dread at being surrounded by people, adults, who could easily overpower him. He'd blame Maury for it, since the doctor forced him to come to this stupid school in the first place. From the other side of that long table, Dumbledore rose to his feet. Dazai found himself similarly rising to attention. "I have a few start-of-term notices I wish to announce." He paused. "The first years, please note that the Dark Forest is strictly forbidden to all students. Also, our caretaker, Mr. Filch, would like to remind you that the third-floor corridor on the right-hand side is out of bounds to everyone who does not wish to die a most painful death." At the word death, Dazai perked up, eyes lighting with a mix of interest and eagerness. He bounced on his heels, already trying to imagine what sorts of things might be hidden on the third floor. Although he wasn't too keen on a painful death per se, Dazai couldn't fight the thrill of excitement at the notion of dying on campus. Beside him, Ron must have picked up on Dazai's barely restrained longing for death, because the Weasley shot him an indescribable look that he was choosing to translate as support. "Thank you," the headmaster finished simply. Feeling a bit anticlimactic, Dazai rolled on the balls of his heels as if to shake off some loose energy. "Now," McGonagall spoke once Dumbledore was seated once more, "when I call your name, you will come forth. I shall place the sorting hat on your head, and you will be sorted into your houses." Without further affair, she held the hat aloft. "Abbott, Hannah." Dazai allowed himself to watch the girl take a seat on the stool, very interested in just what this hat would do. The wrinkled, old hat fell slightly over Hannah's eyes. He squinted up at the hat, trying to figure out what it might do, only to stare, dumbfounded, as the frayed edges of the pointed hat opened up in a facsimile of a mouth. The hat talked? Dazai felt a grin break out onto his face, finding the useless little things. Wizards poured their magic into vaguely amusing. He watched with empty humor as student after student was sorted into their respective houses. But it wasn't long until McGonagall was calling, "Dazai, Osamu." There was a momentary pause in applause for the previous student, and Dazai took his cue to step forward. Someone gave him a pat on the back. Dazai took a guess on it being Ron, seeming not to care for the flinch that rocked his body in return. Dazai took a seat in front of the 1,000 eyes in the room. He felt their attention tenfold weigh down on him as he rearranged his limbs to rest limply on his lap. All of the professors were watching him too, which was all the threat Dazai needed to sit perfectly still. The hat would work on him, right? Above him, McGonagall held the hat over top his chocolate hair, expression blank and practiced. Belatedly, he thought to shut his eyes. It wouldn't do to have the musty hat fall over his eyes like that other girl. There was a prolonged moment of silence, followed by the sound of cloth rustling, then, "Slytherin!" 7 snakes. Dazai's eyes shot open. The hat hadn't even touched him. It was still held a foot above, him in McGonagall's hand. Blinking owlishly, Dazai turns to face the professor, however. She wore a look equally as surprised as him. And the hat, was it moving? Fighting against McGonagall's grip? It almost looked like the sorting hat was straining to get away from him. Not great, he thought. feeling his spine tense up as McGonagall continued to stare straight into him. Clearing the expression from his face, Dazai turned emptily back to the tables lined out before him and stood. Almost unconsciously, Dazai sought out Ron in the crowd of other first years, but couldn't seem to meet the boy's eyes. He was nearly sitting down before someone thought to clap. Was it really so odd, the hat not touching his head? It was pretty far away when it determined his house fate, and could the others see how hard the hat had fought to stay away from touching him? Oh well, it's not like Dazai cared, so that made it. A problem for Mori? That sounded good. It felt even better to be sitting down at the tables and out of everyone's attention. He was distantly aware of Hermione, Ron, and Neville all being sorted into Gryffindor, and felt a slight sting at the thought of his 3 potential subordinates being sorted differently to him. He'd have to make more allies in Slytherin, although having some connections to the other houses couldn't hurt. He had a feeling those Weasley twins wouldn't be hard to train either. He didn't seem to be lacking in Gryffindor support then. The only other thing that vaguely captured his interest was the sorting of some kid named Draco Malfoy. Just like with Dazai, although to a much weaker extent, the sorting hat had declared Slytherin before ever really touching the boy's head. Let the feast begin. Dazai let the announcement shake him from his thoughts. He was further startled from his musings when the table, just empty seconds before, became flooded with various dinner foods. A basket of bread, a full chicken, corn on the cob. Dazai's head was spinning with all the options. The sudden, overwhelming smell of cooked meats was noxious. Dazai had never been able to handle the smell of food, and it was putting his stomach off before he'd even began. Dazai regarded the hand for a second, before sighing and shaking the hand. Dazai. You some sort of rich brat, then? You can't make allies by insulting people. Part of Dazai's brain hissed in a voice disturbingly like Mori's. Please don't just say whatever it is you're thinking in that misguided little brain of yours. Then come here and do it yourself, stupid doctor. Immediately, Draco's grin slipped into a sneer. Don't you know who I am? The Malfoy family is far more powerful than whatever wizarding family you come from. Mentally, Dazai weighed this Malfoy estate against the Port Mafia, and came up with a very different conclusion than Draco had. He hated to admit it, but the echo of Mori's voice was probably right. He needed allies, especially ones who were apparently well-connected in the wizarding world. At least he'd probably have more fun that way rather than just isolating himself. Dazai. Another voice wondered. I don't think I've ever heard that name before. Are you even from a wizarding family? Dazai made a face, waving a bandaged hand around vaguely. Oh, Merlin, are you a muggle-born? A muggle? Draco gaped. In Slytherin? Dazai smiled colorlessly. Seems that way. Can you pass the crab? Around the table, a mix of expressions bore down on Dazai. Some of them were wide-eyed, looking a bit startled at his offhand, unconcerned demeanor. However, most of the other snakes glared him down with an indescribable vitriol to their gaze. Maybe he'd have been worried, but Dazai had seen glares worse than these children's. Well, a dark-skinned, plain-looking boy piped up, voice wilting as he spoke. The hat did seem to think he was Slytherin. It called our house out before Professor McGonagall was even close to putting it on him after all. Draco's upper lip pulled at the corner. Still, Blaze, a mudblood in Slytherin. It must have made some sort of mistake. After all, what sort of impression did the hat get if it didn't even touch him? I say we make Dumbledore sort him again. It took a great deal of effort, but Dazai restrained himself from rolling his eyes. Instead, he reached out for a plate of crab, excessively pleased to have found something edible for dinner. He took a bite while the others bickered. Didn't it barely touch you too, Malfoy? Everyone at the table froze, staring wide-eyed at Dazai, who only waved a crab leg around in response. Don't you call me one of those no-good Gryffindors. Oh my God, you're so serious. Dazai snorted. I saw him talking with a Weasley earlier, Pansy tacked on helpfully. Speaking of Weasley, Dazai bent his neck to see around the other tables to the Gryffindor students on the other side. They needed to work on their telepathy. How he was supposed to train a subordinate when they weren't roomed together was looking to be a bit challenging. But Dazai had done more with far less in the past. He wasn't really worried about the house divisions keeping them apart. After all, a dog always comes back to its master. Is this what kids these days called friendship? Malfoy's sharp voice interrupted his musings. Hanging out with that blood traitor too? Blood traitor? How curious. Wizards sure had a lot of terms and classifications for one another. that mostly seemed to benefit infighting. It was all a bit boring, honestly. With that outburst hanging in the air, Dazai decided he was finished eating. He wasn't going to be able to stomach anymore, despite that he'd barely eaten half a serving. When he pushed his plate away, Dazai noticed that Blaze Kid giving him a curious look. He shrugged it off. Dazai let himself zone quickly after that, growing bored of Draco trying to get a rise out of him and not being able to catch Ron's eyes over the crowd. He didn't peg Draco as a huge threat, nor did he find much motivation to sweet-talk the brat. Maybe later, when Dazai's headache had settled, he could deal with Malfoy, but for tonight it wasn't majorly important. It was just school, after all. It wasn't like he needed people to back him up for anything. At some point, Dazai must have gotten lost in his thoughts, because he only became aware that the Great Hall was emptying out when Blaze put a hand on his shoulder. "We're going to the dorms now," he said, voice displaying none of the vague humor Dazai read in his yes. Around Blaze's shoulder, Pansy's obnoxious face popped up. "Draco wanted to leave you, so you should really be thanking us for staying behind." Ugh. He hated being so spacey, but Dazai couldn't seem to keep his thoughts in one place. With all the strangers around, he was feeling too wound up to focus. It was easier to just zone out than to catalog the hundreds of possible threats his brain was supplying. "Dangerous," his mind hissed. "Keep your eye on the enemy, idiot." Shooting the girl a hollow look, Dazai carefully chose not to reply. He got to his feet and followed them to where the other Slytherins were gathered by the door. It wasn't long before the Slytherin pack was filing out of the Great Hall after the feet of who Dazai guessed to be prefects. Beside him, Pansy sped up to walk side by side with Draco, and with a parting glance, Blaze joined her. Dazai let them go with little more than a raised brow. Dazai trailed at the back of the group, trying to memorize the path they were taking, but got bored after the 20th turn. He'd probably figure it out eventually. Instead, Dazai turned his attention to the weird things around Hogwarts. The walls were lined with paintings framed with gold and dark woods, and filled with people and places Dazai wasn't familiar with. However, it quickly became apparent the people in the paintings were moving, staring down at the students, waving, speaking. Dazai tried not to make eye contact with any of the paintings. Just how alive were those painted people? He tried to envision what it must be like to live forever encased in oil paints and turpentine. He was glad when they entered the dungeons, because the walls were empty and cracked. The way those painted people watched him filled Dazai's stomach with iron and lead. Abruptly, the group comes to a stop. Dazai has to stand on his toes just to see their destination, an empty stone wall. The password is gillyweed. A young girl, the prefect, announced clearly. "It changes once every fortnight, so be sure to check the notice board inside, or else you'll have to spend the night out here. First years, students from other houses are not welcome inside. Under no circumstances should you invite someone like that in. That includes sharing the password. Understand?" A murmured agreement ran through the students. "Good. Now our head of house is Professor Snape. If you have any concerns, his office is just beyond that set of stairs there. Otherwise, we snakes stick together. Don't hesitate to turn to each other for anything. That will be all. Now, gillyweed." Though he had to peek around his peers, Dazai could hear the proceedings. The sound of stones moving, followed by footsteps, told Dazai some sort of passage had opened up. Frowning, he followed the last of the Slytherins through the doorway and into the common rooms. He considered the room with a dull look. It was colder down here in the dungeons than it had been in the Great Hall, unfortunately. Dazai was the sort to catch a chill easily, and he already just wanted to hide under a blanket until someone came to put him out of his misery. He noted a fireplace on the far wall, which was a small mercy, really. Aside from the fireplace, Dazai thought the design seemed relatively opulent. Green lights, leather sofas, a nice-looking chess set, although he wasn't sure green lanterns were especially practical for reading. He could whine about it later. For now, Dazai was tired. Maybe it was whatever made no longer human activate constantly, but he felt like he'd been hit by a truck. Limbs heavy and expression drawn, Dazai immediately set off towards the dorms. It's not like he cared to make nice with these snakes anyway. As Dazai retreated to the dorms, he was distantly aware of Malfoy's glare on his back, of everyone's glare on him, but he was too busy deciding which bed to take to bother responding. He shut the dorm door behind him with only enough force to make the heavy door close properly. He sat down on the bed furthest from the entrance and pulled his knees to his chest. All the other snakes were still in the common room, He could hear them chatting away excitedly through the door. They sounded happy, but Dazai couldn't find it in himself to empathize with something pleasant like that. Instead, Dazai tried to imagine himself chatting with them. Even though he rarely left his room, Dazai was well trained in the art of socializing. He knew just what to say for every last one of these brats to fall in love with him, to follow his every command. He sighed, drawing himself in tighter. Too many people, too much noise. It was sort of odd he'd be sleeping in the same room as these other kids. Dazai was so used to having a bedroom all to himself, he felt a bit on edge at the notion of doing otherwise. Being surrounded by all these people already had him so on edge, but he didn't think locking the door would be enough to keep the others out for long. With another breath, Dazai fell onto his back and closed his eyes. Dazai was sitting on the boss's desk, face empty and emotionless, not even moving when a crack of thunder shook the building. There was rain pounding on the window like it was asking for entrance, but no one would let it in. Instead, Dazai was forced to simply imagine what it would be like to drown then die for good. Having your head forced underwater hurt, so it probably was a bad way to die. Mori stood in the doorway, smiling pleasantly. He had a smile that was hard to define, so Dazai didn't bother. He couldn't decide if it was kind or malicious. Most people around him didn't smile. Dazai lived his entire life trapped between the four walls of the Mafia headquarters, a cold steel barrier dotted with lies and crime. He thought it was a nice frame, but the paintings at Hogwarts had intricate ones made of pure gold. The people in those paintings were smiling, as if their watercolor lives weren't worth living. Mori waved him over, and Dazai smiled like his face was drawn on. When Dazai woke from his dream, he did it with all the stillness of a corpse. His eyes slid open slowly, the movement casual enough not to give away his waking. When had he fallen asleep? He must have been more tired than he thought to fall asleep so carelessly when strangers were around. Just the idea made Dazai feel sick, so he turned his attention to something else. The others must have come in at some point to sleep. The idea that these students were in here while he slept was horrifying, even if it seemed like no one had done any more than pass out, too. Dazai hadn't even woken up when they'd come in. He's never felt so unprotected before, or at least not so unprepared to be this vulnerable. Still, sleeping had cleared Dazai's head somewhat, though he could still feel that faint discomfort of his ability activating. It wasn't horrible, so Dazai just rolled his shoulders and got started with his day. Now that there were others around, Dazai let that vacant smile appear on his face and willed his posture to look more confident and laid back. He only ever let himself look so haunted and afraid when no one was around, after all. Idly, he wondered what time it was. Dazai usually didn't sleep for long, or consistently, but it must have been at least a few hours for him to feel this well-rested. Dazai changed into clean robes and cleaned up in the restroom before entering the common rooms with a book bag in tow. He replaced his old bandages without ever peeking at the skin below. It wouldn't do to look undone in front of these kids, and now that Dazai was working on a restful mind, he was even more wary of Draco Malfoy. Last night he'd been feeling too, overstimulated by all the people that he'd retreated almost immediately to the solitude of his room. Now that he had the mental capacity to consider, however, Malfoy definitely had a problem with him. The brat might be fun to mess with. Hopefully Dazai would get used to all the buzz and energy around Hogwarts so he could scheme a bit more without feeling so wound up, yet simultaneously exhausted. Just as Dazai settled into a plush chair right beside the lit fireplace, a noise startled him from his thoughts. Dazai felt his spine snap into place, but he kept his face neutral as he spun to see whoever was awake. They met his eyes evenly and wore a curious frown. "Young Snake," they spoke. Dazai startled somewhat at the hollow, echoing way their voice sounded. "Did you know you have the strangest energy about you?" "Ah." Dazai tried for a smile. "Did you know you're covered in blood? Ate something about ghosts?" The man standing in front of Dazai was quite the image, so Dazai took a moment to catalog just what exactly he was seeing. Covered in blood, transparent, floating 2 feet off the ground. "Ghost?" Dazai hazarded a guess. Yes, that's right," the man said. "You may call me the Bloody Baron, as your house ghost." "House ghost, huh? That seems like a trivial thing to have." The Baron's eyes narrowed and his gaunt face pulled tense. "Watch your tongue, boy." Dazai shrugged and readjusted on the armchair so that he was face to face with the Bloody Baron and his legs were dangling off the side. He squinted at the bloody wound the Baron wore. That's self-inflicted, right? Congratulations. Congrats on a successful suicide. Ah, I'm jealous. With a whine, Dazai melted back into the armchair. He didn't really peg this ghost as a threat. If anything, he pitied the poor man. Committing suicide but still being forced to live on as a ghost? Horrible. Sickening. He wanted to die more than ever, but he wanted to stay dead when he finally kicked the bucket. Jealous. And... Wait, you wanted something, didn't you, Mr. Ghost? Dazai hummed, kicking his feet out childishly. Yet I get a strange feeling from you. It's hard to say, though I suppose if you don't know, there's no point in asking. Suddenly, the boys' dorm room door opened. Blaze stood in the doorway, blinking dully at the Baron and Dazai, as if silently asking what was happening. Good morning, Baron Dazai, he said after a moment. The bloody Baron cleared his throat and floated a few feet away from Dazai, smiling sheepishly. Right. I'll be leaving then. Good luck on your first day, young snakes. Hey, we were talking, Mr. Ghost Guy. You can't just leave like that. Baron. He drew out the pronunciation and floated towards the front wall. When the Baron started to phase through the stone face, he added, And I'm sure we'll be seeing each other around. With that, he phased fully through the wall, disappearing from sight completely. Dazai huffed, drawing his shoulders together with a frown. He'd have to track the Baron down later. Things always worked out better when he had all the information. And Dazai didn't like the idea that the ghost knew something about him he didn't. Making friends with the house ghost? Interesting choice, Dazai. Dazai fell back into the chair, bandaged limbs spilling over the sides carelessly. I'm not sure anyone is this school is much good for company. Say, what time is it? He raised a brow, but kept his expression mostly blank otherwise. Dazai thought he saw a hint of humor there and counted it as a win. 6:30. Breakfast starts in about half an hour. Blaze frowned. You went off to bed early last night. Some of the others thought you might have been sick. Dazai waved the concern off with a loose limb. He didn't care to explain that he'd spent most of his life completely isolated, and that all the people made him antsy, so he didn't. Instead, he tidled a bit closer to the fireplace. Maybe. Hey, shouldn't you be trying to bully me or something? Why, because you're a Muggle-born? Blaze scoffed and, after a moment's hesitation, took a seat near Dazai. Most of our housemates take great pride in their blood purity. I'm not one of them. I'd advise against letting anyone know you aren't pure. But it seems you've already burnt that bridge. Just keep your head down. Are you giving me advice? Blaze is nicer than I thought. Blaze startled in his seat, blinking wide-eyed at where Dazai had sprawled out in his own chair. It's a word of advice from one Slytherin to another and nothing more. Still, the boys. Lips pulled up into a haughty smile as he stared into the fire. Right, maybe Blaze would make a good subordinate too. The boy would take a bit of work, obviously, but Dazai could use the challenge. Besides, it would be nice to have someone loyal to him in Slytherin, if only just to have someone nearby to order around. It wasn't long after that the other snakes woke and started filing out of their dorms. He wasn't blind to the glares some of them sent his way. Being a Muggle-born really hurt his standing that much? Dazai watched as the room grew more crowded by the minute with barely concealed distaste in the way his lips pressed together. Blaze shot him a curious look before getting to his feet. I'm off to find Pansy. Almost as an afterthought, Blaze added in a muted voice, If you want to get to breakfast before it's too crowded, you should head out now, friend. Dazai flushed. That was odd. He shook himself and rose to his feet, staring at Blaze's departing back with a lost expression. Dazai rolled his shoulders, wondering what it was about his body language that gave away his discomfort. Well, he'd take Blaze's advice and go to the Great Hall now for breakfast anyway. He was already looking forward to being in that place when it wasn't so obnoxiously populated. Even though he wasn't sure he could stomach much food at the moment, Dazai spotted on the bulletin board on his way out that schedules would be passed out during breakfast. Maybe he'd find a Weasley while he was out. Breakfast wouldn't be so abhorrent if he had someone like that to bully in the meantime. Scratching the back of his head, Dazai pushed his way around a throng of students and left the common room. Once he was in the dungeon halls, Dazai felt a shiver run up his spine. It was so annoyingly cold down here. He'd have to start carrying a blanket around with him. But that might look silly. And Dazai was trying to gather subordinates. He'd need their respect, even if starting a little gang was just a hobby for him. When Dazai had trekked up the last of the steps, He was almost relieved to find himself by the entrance hall. Given how little he'd paid attention the night before, Dazai had anticipated, having to wander the school grounds until he stumbled upon the Great Hall. But that didn't seem to be necessary. After all, he recalled the path between the entrance and Great Hall to be relatively straightforward. All for the better, he supposed, though the idea of getting lost did have some appeal. It was only a few minutes of walking before he was pushing open one of the large doors to the Great Hall. "Ah," he hummed, bouncing on his heels with a pleasant smile. "I'm the only one here. Lucky me you can receive your schedule." Dazai watched the man settle into his seat near the front of the hall with thinned eyes, suddenly wishing he could have the Great Hall to himself again. The room was wide and empty, but he was already starting to feel caged in. Still, he offered only a disarming, toothy smile in response. Dumbledore chuckled. "Well, I won't keep you. Enjoy your breakfast." After that, the headmaster began to serve himself. Once the eyes were off him, Dazai forced himself to relax. They weren't a threat. He was just overreacting. Looking to his own table, Dazai was startled to realize a few dishes of breakfast foods had scattered themselves around him. Magic. Right. He grabbed a glass of water, pulling it close with a sigh. There were too many options, he thought, and the smell was a bit off-putting, even if it was only the sweet odor of cinnamon oatmeal and the reek of burnt meat. Instead, Dazai withdrew a textbook from his bag and began reading to the sound of Dumbledore and McGonagall chattering amongst themselves. After a few minutes, students started to arrive one by one. At first, the disturbance barely even registered to him, and when it did, he could easily ignore it. However, by the time each seat on Dazai's sides were occupied, he knew ignoring the other students was a lost cause. Dozens of faces Dazai didn't bother to put names to flooded the Great Hall, until it was too noisy with conversations and laughter to focus. He snapped his book shut, Magical Theory, when Draco sat down directly in front of him across the table. The blonde stared at him for a moment, wearing a haughty look before clearing his throat. "I believe we may have gotten off on the wrong foot." Dazai shot a sideways glance to Blaze, who met his blank expression with a shrug before flipping through a newspaper left on the table, breaking at Gringotts. An interesting headline, but nothing for Dazai to bother himself with. "It has come to my attention that the Sorting Hat must have placed you amongst us Slytherins for a reason. It did sort you nearly as fast as it did me, after all. It sorted me faster than you, actually." Draco spoke over Dazai, seeming not to hear the correction at all. "Because of this, I would like to offer a proverbial olive branch to you, Dazai. Clearly, a mudblood such as yourself was placed here for a reason. What other reason would a dirty muggle like yourself be put into Slytherin than for me to fix you? As such, I'd like to offer my guidance. You'll be following me around, maybe doing my homework. And in return, I'll teach you the ways of a true wizard." Malfoy's smile was sharp and his eyes deceptively kind. The wild, over-dramatic gesturing wasn't making him look as serious as Dazai thought he was hoping for, however. "You can thank me now." "You want me to be your subordinate?" Dazai blinked, flustered with the gracious offer. Under his breath, Dazai mumbled to himself, "I think you've got our roles confused here. Subordinate. Yes, I like that word. Look at you, already doing your part in supporting pure wizards. Subordinate. Him. Dazai didn't do subordinate. Where did this Malfoy brat get off? And here he was prepared to play nice. Dazai's blinking expression must have been answer enough, because Malfoy continued with a self-assured nod. "Good. I'd like you to meet Crabbe and Goyle." The boy gestured to the two lumps of sentient meat at his side. "They— Wait. Draco, you already have subordinates?" Dazai shrieked. "That can't be. There's no way you did that faster than me." Draco preened at the unintentional compliment, running a slender hand over his tie. He glared down Crabbe and Goyle, expression tight and searching. Only the more Dazai looked, the less he was able to tell the two apart. He made a face of vague comprehension. Crabbe and Goyle drew themselves together beside Malfoy, looking decently meat-headed and dull. "Watch your mouth, mudblood," one of them shouted, and at the same time the other intoned, "Back off, mudblood! You two are the same person." Draco's mouth twitched into a serious-looking scowl immediately. The boy ground his teeth together with enough force that Dazai thought they might just snap. Dazai prepared himself to be thoroughly berated by getting comfortable enough to zone out and stare at the wall for the next 10 minutes. "Can't you go one day without running your mouth, boy?" Dazai blinked up into the dull eyes of Professor Snape, forcing himself not to startle in surprise. Before he could reply, the greasy professor handed him a slip of paper. "I don't want to see any fighting. Am I understood?" Across the table from him, Draco shuffled in his seat and grumbled, "Yes, sir." Dazai could see in the boy's eyes that the message hadn't quite stuck. Evidently satisfied, Snape turned on his heels and left them. Dazai watched him go with a wary eye. He resisted shooting a final glare at Malfoy once the professor was gone, and was mildly amused to see the other boy forcibly clamp down on his tongue instead of bickering further. Dazai turned his focus onto his timetable. "Charms is first, huh?" Dazai turned to Blaise, seeing the other boy inspecting his schedule in favor of the newspaper. Draco also seemed to be reading his with a bit too much scrutiny. A quick glance at Thug 1 and Thug 2 revealed that they might not even know how to read. All was well and good. Dazai was looking forward to learning something before he wrote this whole Hogwarts experience off as a waste of time. After all, he didn't think Mori would take kindly to him sending a letter, "I don't have magic, I'm coming home," before he'd even tried something out. He'd give his fancy new stick a wave, then send the letter. Speaking of fancy new sticks, Dazai thought, feeling around in his book bag. After a moment of searching, his hand bumped up against the sleek black case sitting in there, unopened. Ollivander had sent it just days before he had to catch the train. But Dazai had been so busy with mafia work that he never got to look at it. Still, he'd tossed it into his bag this morning, unsure if they'd get a chance to do some magic in class. Draco, Pansy, Blaise, and those other two stood up, and Dazai dropped his hands to his side in anticipation. As all the other students around them also got to their feet, Dazai began to feel a bit out of place. He grabbed the strap of his book bag and rose as well. Malfoy cleared his throat, beaming oddly. "Well, Dazai, I best be off to class. Do think about that offer of mine." He tipped his head back, sneering. "Crabbe, Goyle, let's go. See you in class, subordinate." With that, Draco departed from the great hall. Dazai watched him go with two empty eyes and casually imagining all the things he could do to break that boy to his will. He'd start with the fingers, then maybe pull a few teeth. Blaise manifested beside him with a dull expression on his face. "Subordinate, huh? You're really stepping up in the world." "I'm not." Dazai stop-started, feeling his cheeks dust pink. "If anything, he's my subordinate." "Does Draco know that?" "You're less nice than I thought." Blaise shrugged. Without warning, he took a step past Dazai and continued out of the great hall. "Maybe. Now aren't you coming to class?" "We'll be late if you keep dawdling. 9 potions." "Charms," Dazai whined, dragging his arms behind him as they walked through the winding halls, "is boring. All these classes are boring." Stepping onto the stairway just moments before it started to rotate, Draco raised a brow and sneered. "You were barely paying attention. Are you sure that isn't your problem?" "True," Blaise added. "It's only a lecture day for most classes, of course. Though Professor Flitwick promised that tomorrow we could work on casting." "Whatever. Don't grumble at me. That's hardly how a subordinate of mine should act." "I will push you off these stairs." Draco shot him an unimpressed looking, and Dazai was forced to admit that Grunts 1 and 2 could probably punt him halfway across campus before he even reached out to push the weasel to his death. Still, something about Dazai's threat must have stuck, because Malfoy rushed up the last few steps and was the first one off once the stairway came to a stop. Dazai grinned. "Potions next," Draco announced, now a full 3 feet ahead of Dazai and sending the bandaged boy a cautious glare. "We have it with the Gryffindors." I've never heard someone put so much disdain into one word before. "Dazai, shut up." Oh, there it is again. Suddenly, Crabbe and Goyle appeared on each of Dazai's sides, 2 towering masses of pure brawn. The part of his brain that was constantly screaming, "Get out, shut up, it's dangerous," started screaming just a little bit louder. But Dazai was feeling well rested today, so he shut those thoughts down and replaced them with apathy. "Malfoy, keep your dogs in line," Dazai said, beaming with a particular sharpness to the corners of his eyes. Though he was fairly sure the comment was meant to be silent, Dazai distinctly heard Blaise mumble, "Aren't you one of those dogs?" Which, rude. Beside him, Pansy glared holes into Dazai's skull. Draco assessed him with a clean look, before offering another one of his nasty smirks. After a moment, he waved his thugs off, I'm trying to be nice, you know. I'm even letting you hang out with us for the day. You should show some gratitude, Mudblood. Something about that smile irked Dazai. He had a smile like a less intelligent Mori, which was too annoying of a concept to consider for long. Any time spent thinking about that bastard doctor was wasted time, so Dazai let himself tune into a different, less sadistic aspect of Malfoy. Dazai offered a kind, if dishonest, smile. Well, I guess Draco's not such bad company. People seem to respect you. Respect, Dazai had learned, meant that people stayed away from you. Draco drew attention when he wanted it, and chased it away when he didn't. At first, Dazai had only planned to stick with this punk until he got bored with teasing him, but now, Dazai appreciated having some wiggle room in the otherwise crowded hallways. It was doing wonders for his mood. Or maybe it wasn't respect. Maybe it was how Crabbe and Goyle glared at anyone who came within 2 feet of them. I need subordinates of my own already. He'd have to hunt down those Weasleys during lunch and see if they would follow him around like a pack of stupid dogs. Then he wouldn't have to listen to Malfoy tell him how to act like a pure wizard, unless he had a particular longing to bleed from the ears. Yes. Well, Draco hummed, sounding very assured suddenly. We're here in the dungeons. They were, Dazai noted with a shiver. He followed lazily into the classroom. The room was large and cold, he noticed immediately. Instead of desks, the classroom was filled with small work tables that would probably fit only 2 or 3 people each. A few others were already there, though mostly Dazai couldn't recognize them beyond the vague sense of seeing them during the sorting. He looked through the other students, trying to see if, "Oh, I'm sitting over there," Dazai said suddenly, interrupting something Malfoy was saying. "Bye, come back here." Dazai waved Draco's objection off, feeling a small swell of humor at the idea of leaving his bosses in the dust. He rounded the corner of one workstation and came to a stop, grinning. "Ron, my dear friend whom I haven't seen since yesterday, I found you." Dazai. The red head startled, flailing back in his seat. He ran a hand through his hair and took a calming breath. Dazai was very good at predicting how people would react, but when Ron's expression hardened and his voice became steel, even he was a bit caught off. "Guard. Get out here, Snake." Dazai blinked owlishly, then took a seat anyway. "You tricked me into sitting with you on the train, but now that you're Slytherin, I want nothing to do with you. Go sit with your new Death Eater friends." He may have underestimated the strength of these house loyalties after all. "Huh. Don't be like that," Dazai whined, kicking his feet. "Besides, I don't want to sit by that pompous Draco kid. Did you know he wants me to be his subordinate? The nerve. Take your seats." Dazai's mouth clamped shut as Professor Snape traipsed into the room with an aura that undoubtedly commanded respect. Immediately, any student standing fell to the nearest seat, and Ron was no exception. Snape's appearance had locked them in as seat buddies. Curious, Dazai glanced to the other side of the room to see where Draco, Blaze, and Pansy had ended up. They were all seated very near to one another and shooting wide-eyed stares his way. Dazai gave them a thumbs up. Professor Snape came to a halt at the front of the class, his eyes rolling over each student with vague disdain. Dazai noticed a few Gryffindors flinch under the harsh glare sent their way with a bit of humor. When Snape got to Dazai's spot next to Ron, something like confusion flitted across his expression. It was quickly stamped out, but Dazai caught it. Was it really so odd, cross-house friendships? Well, maybe not friendship. Put your wands away. There is little foolish wand waving here, Snape declared after a second. Dazai let himself melt into the table, already bored. There was no foolish wand waving in any of these classes. He still hadn't even had a chance to pull his wand from its box because it had been one syllabus after the next all day. Snape continued talking, and Dazai let himself focus only on the echo of the professor's words around the dungeons. "Many of you will hardly believe this is magic. I don't expect you will really understand the beauty of the softly simmering cauldron with its shimmering fumes, the delicate power of liquids that creep through the human veins, bewitching the minds, ensnaring the senses. I can teach you how to bottle fame, brew glory, and even stopper death, if you aren't as big a bunch of dunderheads as I usually have to teach." Dazai rolled his eyes, slumping forward momentarily. Just another boring class, huh? Although stopper death was giving him some ideas. A few chitters rang out from the Slytherin side of the room, but otherwise, the classroom was silent. At his side, Ron tensed up horribly stiff and scooted his chair an inch away. What were they so scared for? Sure, the professors here put Dazai on edge, but he'd spent an entire shopping trip with Snape, and he was pretty sure that guy was harmless. We will not be brewing any potion of the sort, Snape growled. He walked forward until he was directly in front of Dazai's desk. The teacher's eyes were searching, livid little things. Under the harsh gaze, Dazai picked at the fraying edges of his bandages. Now, unless anyone else has any idiotic questions, I'd like to move forward with my class now. The room was dead silent. As I thought. Now then. Professor Snape's lecture blurred together, and Dazai felt himself absorbing information more than participating with it. He had a sharp mind. Usually just hearing something once was enough for the information to stick with him, and while he had been looking forward to learning more about this mysterious wizarding community, the application was a bit, well, he didn't want to learn all this kid stuff. Dazai wanted to know more. Who are the major players in this war? What are the most dangerous spells and creatures? But did he need to know that a Bezoar can cure poison? Probably not, since Dazai really only saw himself as intentionally poisoning people. This was boring, and he was going to tell Mori as much in his first letter next week. Let that doctor know he was going to quit Hogwarts and drown himself in the lake. After the rest of the class passed, Dazai got to his feet and stretched. Ron, who'd been relatively silent the entire class, jumped to his feet and immediately started off towards the door. Hey, Ron, wait up. The Weasley ducked his head and continued walking off faster. Dazai didn't hesitate to hurry off after him. On his way out, he caught the eye of Professor Snape, who wore a strained look at the interaction. Skipping the last few steps out the door, Dazai reached out for the sleeve of Ron's robes. Don't follow me, mate. I'm not associating with a Slytherin, so leave me alone. Dazai pouted but withdrew his hands to his sides anyway. Aw, but we got along so well on the train. And you found all my books for me too, Ron scowled. That's fine. Dazai had been thinking about this all through class, and he decided that he still liked the idea of training Ron as a subordinate. The kid had potential, or something. Dazai put on a pleasant expression, hoping to disarm Ron's distrust of him. It'd be a shame to not stay friends. And, WL. What? The boy countered, suspicious. Won't they be pleased to find I've spread my influence into not one but 2 houses? Dazai waved him off. I'm sure there's something in this for you somewhere. Ah, maybe I'll share some Slytherin secrets with you. I'm sure your brothers will love the intel for their pranks. You want to. Ron struggled, seeming to roll the wording around on his tongue in distaste before echoing. Be my subordinate? Subordinate. Yes, that sounds right. Dazai preened. He quickly recalled what Draco had said to him just that morning. Look at you, already doing your part to rehabilitate this poor Muggle Slytherin. So kind. So kind. No way. Aw, come on. Help a friend out. I'll even let you see my owl like you wanted to. You can have it if you take good care of Mem. Ron startled and glanced over his shoulder to where the last of the Gryffindors had just disappeared. You'll give me your owl if I hang out with you? Are you that desperate for friends? Sure. Dazai half answered. Around them, the dungeons were almost completely empty. It's time for lunch now, isn't it? The other boy assessed him quizzically, brows pinched together and fingers tense. After a second, he nodded, then started walking. Dazai didn't hesitate to try and keep pace. I'll think about it, but don't get your hopes up. He shot a glance at where Dazai followed a step, behind him. And don't follow me. Yes, boss. Ron groaned into the air. Dazai let himself slow down until Ron was well out of the dungeons, and it was only him left behind. Easy. People were too easy to manipulate. He estimated maybe a month before the kid caved, and came back to Dazai to accept the offer, giving Dazai access to both Slytherin and Gryffindor secrets. It wouldn't be long before he had most of the school under his control. Just in time to drop out of Hogwarts for how terribly dull the classes were. Well, maybe he'd have a bit of fun starting a wizard gang first. Dazai chuckled to himself in the dungeon. Corridors. Someone cleared their throat behind him, and Dazai whirled around to come face to face with Professor Snape. 10 a series of important meetings. Mr. Dazai. Snape spoke clearly despite the growl underneath his words. We need to have a talk. Only 1 day in and he's already in trouble. Figures. Dazai pasted on an empty smile. Yes, sir? Staring down at him with an odd, sharp expression to his face, Snape looked the image of annoyance. The professor stuck his chin out. I think you'd prefer we discuss this in the privacy of my classroom. Come along. Dazai shrugged, following Snape back into the classroom whilst mentally going over everything he'd done in class today. Is this about asking an idiotic question, sir? He should learn to keep his mouth shut, honestly. Even back home when he's beaten and bloody, there's a voice in the back of Dazai's head that begs to instigate further. He's usually good at shutting up and following orders, but he hadn't pegged anyone in potions as a threat enough for such precautions. Professor Snape spun on his heels until he was facing his student once again. He took in a deep breath as if preparing to say something horribly taxing. What? The startled interjection was out of his mouth before Dazai even registered it. Your arm, boy. The one you so foolishly decided to cut into at Diagon Alley. Dazai felt his hand unconsciously move to rub at where the cut had been. With how long the Hogwarts robes were, even the edges of his bandages were barely visible. Fine, he replied almost hesitantly. Dr. Mori took care of it. Well, Mori knew about it at least. Snape's eyes thinned. Thought Dazai wasn't sure what that particular expression was supposed to mean. I'll be the judge of that. Give it here. When Dazai didn't make to hand his arm over, Snape's thin lips grew taut. Perhaps my previous attempts at healing that injury failed, but that doesn't mean I trust Muggle methods for healing. Especially Snape's. Eyes rolled over those bandages again like he was seeing something more. He cleared his throat. See Madame Pomfrey for it at the very least. Who? The Hogwarts matron. Sighing, Dazai let his posture deflate a bit. There's no use in arguing, right? In return, Snape gave a glare that very clearly spelled out, this order was not up for debate. Dazai's gaze wandered under the pressure before eventually landing on Snape's stock of potion ingredients by the far wall. Some of those were bound to be poisonous, right? Maybe something to stop his heart or melt his brain. Murder? Dazai supposed a potion that could kill his enemies would be helpful. He wondered if it was traceable through modern forensic technology. It was an interesting idea, but Dazai waved off the concern with a bandaged hand. I was just curious. Anyway, if we aren't going to brew it, then that's that. Actually, he'd been thinking about a new suicide method via instant death potion, but Dazai wasn't sure how he felt about Snape having that information on him. It wasn't like he expected the professor to be concerned or anything, but something about the way Snape watched him now gave him pause. Dazai held his tongue on the matter of self-poisoning, and pursued less honest endeavors such as running away. Is that all, sir? Dazai watched as Snape's face did some quick, unexplainable gymnastics. Finally, he let out a burdened sigh layered with more background anger than Dazai thought strictly necessary. If your housemates are giving you trouble, I expect you to come to me for help. Understand? Had Professor Snape heard that nonsense he'd told Ron? Oops. Dazai waited a moment longer, declining to answer. Seeming to sigh, Snape nodded, giving Dazai leave to scurry out of the empty potions classroom. He felt a bit like a rat at that moment, but didn't think Snape was nearly clever enough to be the cat chasing him down. Still, the professor pulling him aside like that couldn't mean anything but trouble in the long run. Exiting the dungeons, Dazai decided to wander the halls. It'd been long enough that he wasn't sure where Draco had run off to, and he'd assured Ron he'd give the boys some time to think. He didn't know where anyone was, but there were still 30 minutes left until he had to report in for lunch. Unfortunately, all Dazai had learned about navigating Hogwarts since that morning was that he should stick with a group of people who knew where to go. There was probably a library around here somewhere, right? Maybe he should try and find it. He was lost. There was absolutely no sense to these damn halls. You take one staircase only to turn around and find a different one in its place. Dazai was positive one staircase had taken him to 3 entirely separate buildings at one point. He still wasn't entirely sure how that one worked. Then a staircase had started moving the exact second Dazai's foot left the ground, and he almost fell off the blasted thing. It was when the numbering on the doors went from 100 seconds to 500 seconds in the span, on one right turn, that Dazai decided to call it quits. I'll just die here, he whined to an empty corridor. Slumping into himself, he sighed. It's not the death I imagined, but perhaps the death I deserve, starving in this labyrinthine hellscape, Just kill me already. He took a final step before deciding to just lay down and wait for death. At least I won't have to see Maury's smug face anymore. Or, well, look what we have here. Dazai startled to attention, shooting up from the floor and quickly searching for whoever had snuck up on him. Immediately, Dazai's eyes latched onto a shallow, transparent figure floating near the ceilings. He had black hair, black eyes, and a look positively dripping with mischief. The ghost was wearing a jester's outfit. Dazai would love to humor the chaos there if it wasn't directed at him. Itty-bitty Snakey got lost? Guess beneath all that prim and proper and purity you're all just as incompetent as the rest of these fools. Another ghost, Dazai murmured, mostly for himself. That's horrifying. Please don't tell me that everyone who dies here has to keep living as a ghost. What a horrible place, if that's the case. Dazai will drop out right now and look at other places of education, ones where he can also pursue his interest in novel suicide methods without the threat of having to stick around after. Ah, it's that snot-nosed Slytherin Baron was going on about. The poltergeist cackled. I see what he was talking about. You are a weird little brat, aren't you? The bloody Baron was gossiping about him. He'd have to do something about that. In the meantime, however, it's that strange energy or whatever that Baron guy was talking about, right? He never did get around to explaining, Dazai commented, listlessly prying for information. One last interrogation before the winding, endless hallways decided to walk him straight to his death. He was almost feeling nostalgic. Of course, expressing curiosity turned out to be a mistake when the jester-like ghost guffawed. Wouldn't you like to know, baby snake? Isn't that cute? The lil snakey wants to know something, Dazai huffed. This ghost was beyond annoying, in a way that went beyond the bloody Baron phasing through the wall mid-conversation. When the spirit started miming something lewd over his head, Dazai resolved himself. He was going to kill the ghost. Somehow. Probably torture him for information first. Dazai had definitely dealt with worse and more annoying people before, but he'd never been strictly allowed to torture then kill them. Not all of them, at least. Naturally, then, he should kill the ghost. One way to find out, Dazai thought. Without warning, he reached out to grab at the ghost's foot as the thing swooped overhead. He wasn't sure what he expected to happen, maybe to catch a leg or to pass right through. But it wasn't this. The ghost shrieked, backpedaling as far from Dazai as he could get. The mafioso stared after him blankly, spreading out his fingers in the air where he hadn't even been close to the spirit. Yeah, what was that? He spun on his heels to face the voice, Hermione, with a grin, then a shrug. I'm starting to sense a trend, Dazai groaned. If one ghost could just answer my question before floating through a wall, then I'll gladly die in peace. Hermione blinked in such a way that Dazai assumed was enthusiastic agreement. Well, I'll happily die either way, but I really don't like being left hanging like that. And I'd hate to come back as a ghost with that as my unfinished business. Say, Hermione, when I die, will you help guide my ghostly soul into eternal slumber? What? That, too, Dazai was choosing to read as agreement. At the blank look the girl wore, Dazai quickly pivoted topics. So what brings you down here, anyway? Wherever here is, he didn't add. Should you be talking with a no-good snake like me? Hermione seemed to puff up at the accusation. I, for one, don't believe in all that house segregation nonsense. She smiled like the words were some grand overture. How gracious. Besides, we spoke on the train, didn't we? Slytherin or no, I think you may be nicer than most of these other students, if you don't mind my saying. Dazai? Nice? That was almost funny. Still, he could read the hidden words on the girl's lips well enough to leave Hermione's poor character assessment alone for now. Gryffindor not treating you well? He hazarded. Something about what he'd said must have been startling, because Hermione's hands flew to her mouth. They didn't. Oh, you should have been Gryffindor. They may be bullies, but at least they aren't pure-blood supremacists. Again, Hermione only wore a look that was vaguely confused. Dazai let it slide, because he already had his claws in Gryffindor, and having 2 moles wasn't strictly necessary. Could be fun, though. A good head start on Malfoy, too, who didn't have any Gryffindor supporters, and probably never would. Annoying prick. Whatever. He was starting to think he might actually have a prayer of escaping these damned halls, and that was just a bit more important at the moment. Dazai offered what was probably a pleasant look, and not a deeply exhausted one. You wouldn't happen to know where the library is, would you? The word library seemed to jumpstart Hermione. Dazai briefly enjoyed how easy the girl was to move from topic to topic. She seemed flighty in an intelligent sort of way, if that was possible. Or maybe she was just a people pleaser. Dazai understood the feeling in his own misguided sort of way. I just came from there, actually. It's just down the hall. You mean there's reason to how these halls are organized? And you can understand it? Dazai opened his mouth to say something much more collected, like, please do, or, along the way. Are there any good spots for hanging oneself? But never got the chance. The bushy-haired girl interrupted his intentions with a frown. But there's not really the time for that now. It's lunchtime. Actually, we're a bit late. Don't tell me you've been looking for the library this whole time? Dazai was very, very good at lying. Do you know the way to the Great Hall? But what was the point? Hermione snorted. Dazai followed. You're late, Draco commented idly, looking Dazai up and down. Don't tell me you were planning to spend your lunch with that Weasley. You're the one who ran off to sit with him during potions. Pansy nodded, looking confident. What was that all about? Sitting with a blood traitor of all people, and asking such a stupid question. Do you want to lose us house points? About poisons. Blaise deadpanned. Among other things. No thank you. Information gathering, Dazai repeated, clicking his tongue. It's like you don't listen to a thing I say, boss. When Draco perked up at the title, Dazai added, I'd already laid some groundwork over in Gryffindor back on the train. I wanted to see if anything had paid off. 5 pairs of eyes blinked back at him, dumbfounded. It wasn't until Blaise whistled lowly that the others seemed to snap back to attention. Draco spoke first, ever the leader. Maybe you do have some Slytherin in you after all, Dazai. Cunning, sure, Pansy chimed in, but still a dirty muggle-born. Blaise nodded, looking more amused than impressed, but impressed nonetheless. Almost eagerly, Draco asked, Well, does he trust you? Give it a couple of weeks, Dazai replied simply. Gosh, these brats were just too much fun to mess with. Until then, you've got me all to yourselves. Aren't you lucky? Thank you and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.